If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. To those who genuinely believe they've encountered aliens, UFOs, tall grays, alien creatures, abductions, or other phenomena of the sort, share your scariest stories. The Dark Forest Theory. The Dark Forest hypothesis is the conjecture that many alien civilizations exist throughout the universe, but they could be silent and paranoid. In this framing, it is presumed that any spacefaring civilization would view any other intelligent life as an inevitable threat and thus destroy any nascent life that makes itself known. As a result, the electromagnetic spectrum would be relatively quiet, without evidence of any intelligent alien life, as in a dark forest filled with armed hunters stalking through the trees like ghosts. Camping in Linville Gorge, near the Brown Mountains lights, has been interesting. Some weird creatures were walking next to my camp straight up a mountain, basically. I got the weirdest feeling about their presence. I thought maybe it was a pack of deer, but it seemed like really long and skinny gray-looking things. I don't think I saw an alien, but it sure felt otherworldly. I 100% saw something alive, and it gave me the weirdest feeling I've ever had. And I've had deer, coyotes, and even bears come into camp. There were multiple of these things. They were tall and moving fast. I packed up and left right away. I never get scared, and I haven't felt that way since. This is not my story, but my father-in-law swears he was abducted on a camping trip in the northern Appalachians with about 4 other people. They hiked up near a lake and set up a campsite and set up camp. He says they all remember swimming, then eating dinner, but no one remembers cleaning up camp or going into their tents. They woke up about 10 yards away from their original site, in the exact formation that they had set up the camp, but all of the little stuff was in the same spot, and there was no fire in the middle of the original area but not in the new one. They pulled out a measuring tape my father-in-law had in his backpack from work and measured the distance between the stakes of the tent poles, and it was the exact distance between all of the tent poles from where they originally were and the new area. And before anyone says anything, my father-in-law is a super light sleeper, according to my mother-in-law, doesn't drink or do drugs, has no history or symptoms of mental illness, and was the first one awake. He still refuses to go hiking on that trail to this day. It's an easy hike, so he isn't trying to be lazy and get out of it. 9 years ago, I was camping in northern BC with a group of friends. It was around 10 p.m., and we were in the middle of nowhere, roughly 50 kilometers from any town/store, etc., so it was super dark out. We were sitting around our fire and just listening to tunes and drinking beers, etc. At one point we see a light up on the mountain across the lake from us. This was a decent-sized lake, I'd say roughly 5 kilometers across, surrounded by mountains. So as we noticed the light, assuming that it's other campers that we could visit with, we flashed our flashlight at them, attempting to get their attention. First we flashed our light twice, and they flashed back at us twice. Then 3 times. We were brainstorming going for a hike to meet them when the light seemed to increase in intensity, then proceeding to fly from one side of the massive mountain to a mountain on the other side of the lake. It then sat there and flashed at us a few times, but we turned off our light and at this point were shitting bricks. I remember just going into my tent and putting my sleeping bag over my head out of fear. I fell asleep and woke up, and everything was fine, but for some reason there were roughly half a dozen dead, really big toads outside my tent. What the duck? Still wonder to this day what the heck happened. This happened when I was 19, driving back from San Francisco on the 5 freeway, at the northern end of the valley. This area is flat, and you'll encounter some small hills. It was around 3 to 4 a.m., and I was the only car driving on the road for a good stretch. How the road looks is that it is 2 lanes heading north and southbound, separated in the middle by a 10 to 20 yard strip of land or natural divider. I was heading southbound in the right-hand lane, going about 75 to 80 miles per hour consistently since the speed limit is 70 and Californians are always in a rush. I was fully awake and aware of my surroundings, as I clearly remember no moon shining that night, so the land outside the beam of my headlights is pitch black. As I am driving, I see in my rearview mirror a bright white/yellowish light approaching me from my right. Remember, I am in the right-hand lane and there are no lanes to my right. It zooms up and passes me to the right, and about 50 yards in front suddenly slows down and maintains cruising speed with my car. I am still going 80 miles per hour, and this light is matching my speed perfectly. This goes on for about 5 to 10 minutes, and this whole time I am wondering what the hell it is. Could it be a train? No, there are no trains that run alongside the 5 freeway up here. Maybe a plane? I didn't hear the roar of any engines, either. I tried high beaming it, speeding up and slowing down, going from 100 miles per hour down to 60 miles per hour, and it maintained the exact same distance at whatever speed I was going. All of a sudden I had an overwhelming urge to stop the car and pull over to see what this light was. As I was about to press the brakes, this voice in my head was screaming, "Do not stop the car. Do not stop the car." As soon as I thought to myself, there's no way I am stopping and checking this out, the light stopped immediately as if it hit a wall or a stop sign, and I passed right by it, but all I could see was just a big light. After I passed by it, I was staring at it in my rear view mirror, and the light was just sitting there until the road naturally moved up and down some small hills and I couldn't see it anymore. That whole time I did not see a car, but about a minute after the light stopped, another car was moving northbound on the other side of the freeway. I didn't experience any time missing, but I do distinctly remember that I could not see anything outside the road that was lit up by my headlights and that I could remember exactly what I was thinking and the actions I took while I was driving. 10 years later, I look back and wonder what would have happened if I had stopped. This happened maybe 9 years ago, it was 2007 or so. At the time, I was around 20 or 21. I woke up around 2 to 3 a.m., and I was staring at my wall. I woke up because I felt the distinct presence of someone else in my room. It's like when someone walks into your room while you're sleeping, it can often wake you up even if you don't see them, you will just feel them/hear them. So I woke up to see who this was, but before I turned, I stared at the wall for a moment, as I realized whoever was there was being very quiet. It was rather strange for it to be one of my families. I turned around, and there it was, this huge bipedal figure. Maybe only 3 to 4 feet away from me. It was so huge that when I stared at it from my height laying down, I had to look up to see its face that was near the ceiling. It was literally at least 7 feet tall. I stared at its body and then up at its face. Its body had like electric currents running through it, like if it had veins, they had some sort of blue electricity or energy running through them. It wasn't just one skin color, it literally had blue currents running through it. I've never seen anything similar anywhere else. The first thing I noticed about its face was its cheekbones. They were extremely pronounced. Very bony and sticking out, more so than any human I've seen. To be quite honest, it was hideous. It had the slanted black eyes that one would expect, though they weren't very large. As non-shallow and non-judgmental as I try to be, I found this entity's face rather disturbing. So much so that I looked down because I didn't want to look at it anymore. I realized, looking down and still seeing it, that I wasn't dreaming. While most people would be scared out of their minds, and I was to an extent. At the time I already had several years of martial arts training under me, and I was studying for my black belt rank. The first words that came to my mind when I saw this figure were, "My ass is about to get abducted." However, realizing this, I decided to give it one hell of a fight. Instinctively, I began the process of creating a warrior shout, ki. It's basically an extended roar or shout that comes from the diaphragm that some fighters do to psych themselves out in a fight. When done properly, this type of shout raises adrenaline but yet also calms the body. It also has the advantage of shaking up your opponent at times, giving you an advantage for openings. I began to do this, probably the very loudest I've ever done, and I charged it. At that very moment, everything went black. There was nothing physical felt, just everything went black. I didn't fall asleep. I can't explain it any further. I have no recollection of what happened afterwards. An alien-like creature chased my brother and friends out of the woods. Scotland, UK. So this seems to be the right place to tell of this incident that happened about 8 years ago now. I am putting the words to paper, so to speak, on behalf of my brother, who was there on the night. I can assure you that this is not made up, hence why I am sharing here to see if I could get some sort of feedback on what my brother experienced. Any suggestions, similar experiences, etc. My brother and his friends were walking back home through the woods when they all heard a snap of a branch. When they tuned around to see what it was, they could see the silhouette of a person at the top of the hill, about 100 meters away from where they had just walked down. They watched as it quickly tried to hide behind a tree. My brother and his friends all asked each other if they had all just seen that, to which they all replied, yes. As they all continued to stare, my brother's eyes finally managed to focus within the difficult lighting as it was nighttime and dark. He then described that he could see a head peeking from behind the tree, but in an unusual way. It seemed to be tall, and the motion of the head moving was different. This is when it gets terrifying. The thing steps out from the tree completely and stands at the top of the hill, almost as if it decides, I've been seen. I need to do something, type of attitude. Almost like a fight or flight attitude. My brother said that this is when the overwhelming fear kicked in because they could all see now that the build of this thing couldn't be a person. He described it as being tall, skinny, with gangly, long arms, and having your typical alien-shaped head. And now, To make things even worse, the thing starts to charge down the hill and into the field surrounded by trees where my brother and his friends are. He also said that the pace of the creature was definitely not human, as it gained ground very quickly. So obviously my brother and his friends turned tail and began to run for what it felt like, their lives. He did not want to turn around and look, as he was completely focused on getting away. My brother said that as they were running, he could hear it stumble now and again, and he could also hear the footsteps gaining on them, giving him a good idea of the pace of this thing, which he emphasized on how scary it was. As they approach the village, they come to the end of the field, where a street lamp glows onto the edge of the field. He said once they got into the light, the creature came to an abrupt stop, as if it was scared of the light or that it did not want to be completely revealed. My brother and his friends kept running until they got home. I asked my brother's friends about the incident, and they all still expressed how scary it was. My brother and I love wild camping. Once, the night before the day we were going to go camping, we stupidly began to talk of that night. We ended up not going camping because we creeped each other out so badly that we feared we might see the creature again whilst camping. I am ex-military, so as you know, I have done my fair share of sleeping and camping in the woods. That's how scary this is to us. The level of detail and the fear in my brother's face and voice whilst he tells me of the night reinforced the fact that it actually happened. This event occurred in 2011 and has haunted me every day since. I work in networking, and we are all late. I usually get off around 2 a.m., and then I am up for a few hours before I go to bed. This evening I got off work, and it was raining severely on my way home. When I got home, by chance, the clouds broke, and I stepped outside to have a quick smoke. One of my buddies called me, and we were chatting about work. It was still not raining, and there were low-lying clouds. There are orange street lights in Allen, and they were reflecting off the bottom of the clouds, creating an artificial light. There was a pretty good breeze whipping around, but no rain. I was facing the west, and I looked to my right, and I saw a black cube moving out of the north and traveling south at about 60 to 80 miles per hour. It moved forward in a corner-to-corner motion. This thing was huge. I was astonished to the core of my soul. I sat speechless for a few seconds, knowing that I was seeing something amazing. It was 80 to 100 feet tall. It was a black cube in shape and looked like a rough stone surface. On the side of the cube was a border, and within the border was a circular symbol, if that's what it even was. It looked like if you were to draw a circular maze. It was disturbing the air behind it and creating a vaporous trail spinning behind it and then disappearing. There was absolutely no sound. None. If you know Dallas, it was traveling in the direction of southbound 75 Central Expressway towards downtown. I told my buddy what I had seen, and he lives a few miles south. I fumbled over my words, telling him and asking him to go outside to see if he could see it. He went out to the middle of his street and looked in the direction that it was coming from. After about 5 minutes, it started to rain again. He stood out in the rain for another 15 minutes but never saw it. Good friend, lol. Anyways, no one can ever tell me that I didn't see what I saw that night. I have been ridiculed and laughed at, but I know what I saw. It is almost a relief at this point to know that they are really here. I have been a long-time lurker, and I had to get this off of my chest. I have been searching Black Cube UFO for years now, every single day. I cannot stop thinking about it. I have to see it again. Thanks for listening. I saw a disappearing white light in the sky, then male voice/glowing eyes in the forest. I live in Oregon, and for some odd-ass reason, I feel distinctly that this encounter was not human, the moon, or simply another animal. The first experience I will share happened a few nights ago. I looked up in the sky and saw what appeared to be a soft white glowing light, similar to the moon when a thin cloud is over it. However, it was sharply cut at the bottom in pitch black, so I could only see the top part, which was triangular. I asked my boyfriend what it was, and he and I watched the light fade entirely to black. I had just seen clouds in the sky, so I knew there was no way a cloud was hiding. I am uncertain of time, but I believe around 1 a.m. Second recent experience, my boyfriend and I were walking our dogs just 2 nights ago, at 1 a.m. We live near a small foresty area, and although we occasionally run into people, it's only happened once past 10 p.m. There are streetlights lighting up the parking lot, but the further in you get, the darker it gets. My dogs were acting hyper, and my boyfriend and I could hear loud rustling, as if something large was climbing a tree or walking. I asked him if he heard that, and he said yes. I stopped in my place and listened to hear it again, but it stopped. I shined my flashlight in the direction I heard it, and I saw one small glowing reddish/orange light coming back at me. I had assumed it to be a path reflector or a small animal. I had stated I saw what looked like a small animal's I shined back, but wasn't sure. My boyfriend walked further in, and I walked in too, but more hesitant. He was about 15 feet from me and to my 11, slightly leftish. When I shined my light back to that direction where the light came from before, there were now 4 reddish, orangey gold eyes staring back. One was about my height, or so it looked, but would have been 50 to 100 feet from me. 5'3", the other set of eyes was shorter and smaller. I stared for a while, moving my light around to see if the light shifted as it would on reflectors. Nothing. I whispered out to my boyfriend, "Babe, don't go any further, there's something out there, I can see its eyes." He started walking back, and a deep male voice goes, "Sorry about that," in response to what I said. I didn't say anything back to them, but for some reason I felt instantly safe. I shrugged it off at the time and told my boyfriend, "Okay, at least we know dogs are okay." But afterwards, it just did not feel right. I got back home and remembered that human eyes do not glow in the dark. I could not see the silhouette or even shape of them. Their eyes never once moved or blink. My boyfriend was way closer to them and insists to have never once seen it. But he did hear the guy. I thought about it all night, and it still makes no sense. What kind of response was that? Why did it go from 1 light to 4? Looking at the forest again tonight, I should have been able to see them due to the street lights, but I somehow couldn't. So me, female, 19, and my stepsister, 18, grew up together for a long period of time, starting from 8 to today. When we were younger, we used to camp in New Hampshire at the Rumney Pines Christian Campground, where our families owned a few campers and a cabin. This happened about 10 years ago, maybe a little less. One night during the summertime, at around 7 p.m., my stepsister and I are messing around in our grandparents' camper when it's about time to go back to our parents' camper for bed. We get outside, and the way that the campers are situated, they are perpendicular to the road in a line. At the end of the line of trailers, there's a path that continues to a bunch of old and some renovated campgrounds that were used during the summer and the second pool. It's all dirt and mud, and the trees are plentiful. We were walking from where the main road was towards deeper in the woods to get to our parents' camper. When we started walking, I quickly saw something far in the trees making slight movement, and so I stopped walking. Strangely enough, my stepsister stopped walking too at the exact same time, and we both said to each other, "Do you see that?" All the way at the end of the line of campers towards the left of the road leading into the woods, we saw maybe a 7 to 8 foot tall being with its head and shoulder poke out around one of the trees to look at us, stare for a couple of seconds, then slowly move back behind the tree again. It was really tall, kind of skinny with long proportioned arms, at least its left arm. It was silver/gray with a big round head and short set shoulders. Needless to say, we both ran into the camper and told our parents about what we saw and were told to stop asking for attention. I'm aware that a lot of people won't believe my story, but I'm sure that there will still be people who find it fascinating or may have a similar experience. When I was in high school, my friends and I used to have parties at my family's camp on our farm. Mind you, these parties did not involve alcohol or marijuana, and the camp was just a shack with no electricity. Regardless, we were all around 16 years old and felt pretty badass. We'd use propane lanterns, listen to music via a boombox with batteries, and usually roast some hot dogs over an open fire outside the camp. Prior to the rest of our friends arriving, my best friend and I were riding a four-wheeler around the farm. We didn't have our own vehicle, waiting to spot headlights coming over the horizon when our other friends came. The farm is a pretty desolate area, with only a few homes around and virtually no traffic at night. The view from the top of the hill on our farm spans several miles. We saw a glow in the woods, near the top of the tree line in the distance. Even though it was a little orangey, it was fall time, and I figured it was just a creepy moonrise. We puttered around and took a trail down into some lower territory for a bit while we waited. When we made it back up to the top of the hill, the moon didn't look quite right. It was almost a dull orange color with an oval shape, but fuzzy/hazy. Our friends soon arrived, and we went to the campsite on lower ground. We hung out inside the camp for a while, played some cards, and then decided it was time to build a fire and listen to some music outside. We're all hanging around the fire. It's pitch black behind us, especially with the contrast of the flames. We're listening to music, chit-chatting, and one of our friends suddenly shushes us to be quiet. He was lying in a hammock, and no one took him seriously, but he was closest to the woods behind us. Finally, the tone of his voice changed, and we shut the music off. All we could hear were people talking around us, like from every possible angle at the same time. It was echoey. We heard hushed whispers, murmuring, and frustrated yelling. I vividly remember hearing "Shut up, keep in mind, there's no houses around us" for quite a few miles, and it's like 1 a.m. Then suddenly, total silence. We were sitting there staring at each other, wondering WTF. Then another sound, a jingly sound, many jingly sounds at once. We were all trying to figure out what the sound was, but then I heard a familiar sound, a cow sound. My family's dairy cows were out to pasture across the woods from where the camping area was. Cows have a moo, and then they have a distress moo. I could hear multiple cows making these distress calls, and the jingly sound was the sounds of the cows' collars, which meant the cows were running. Everyone was freaked out and tearing out of there in their vehicles as quickly as possible. My defenses kicked in, someone was out there harassing our cows. I convinced one of the guys with a vehicle to drive to the field. We scanned the field with the headlights. A few cows were just standing there, continuing to make distress calls. The others were scared and running full speed from something that we couldn't see. For anyone who doesn't know, cows are pretty slow-moving creatures and certainly not into distance running. But they had run about a mile's distance all the way back to the barn within several minutes. They were panting and alarmed. We went back to the field and scanned them a few more times before agreeing that we could leave. We all ended up at the same guy's house after, where we sat there awake for the rest of the night. We were all creeped out, but didn't really know what had happened out there. There was an awkwardness, and none of us really spoke about it. I am convinced something alien or supernatural happened that night. Something with that orange oval light we saw. Everyone was so freaked out, even the tough guys we were hanging out with. I'll never forget how alarmed the cows looked, either. My friend and I are discussing something that we, along with two others, witnessed a few years ago. We drove to Blue River, Oregon, late at night to go to the Cougar Hot Springs. We parked our car on a road above a river. There was water on both sides of the road. We looked across the water, and we all immediately noticed the moving lights, faint sound of music/noise, and what seemed like moving fire. It looked sort of like the lights of a small carnival, but without any humans around. There was movement but no people. We went to the hot springs many times during the day and at night, and it makes no sense how a camp or carnival would be there. It is basically impossible because there isn't enough land mass where we were seeing it. Then, we went to the hot springs on the other side of the river, and we were sat in the second of the 4 pools. There was one other person at the hot springs who slowly moved to our pool. And when I say slowly, I mean sluggishly. Without speaking a word to us, they wandered into our pool. The person was moving into different poses, often pointing toward the sky. The person would look us directly at us and then into the sky while also posing. It is hard to explain, but it was an off-putting and intrusive energy, yet very strange. I never met someone who I totally thought wasn't human. Physically, they were short and strong with long hair and shiny, golden skin. I think the person was masculine. Anyway, we all felt the same intuitive feeling that the person we saw came from the place with the strange lights. I'm wondering if people have similar experiences. This was 30 minutes ago, so 4:30 a.m. is approximately where I live. I work night shift, so it was still very dark out. I started driving, and my place of work is in a little residential area with a lot of woods behind them. I was turning on this winding road, and in the trees I spotted a single leg, mid-stride, heading into the trees. The leg was long, like it belonged to someone or something around 6 feet tall, and it was distinctly gray. When my headlights hit the leg, it calmly and almost gracefully stepped into the trees. I pulled up next to the spot and could see very thick vegetation. I looked for movement in the leaves and shrubs to see if something had just walked past it, and I saw no movement, just stillness. Now there are a lot of deer in that area, but this leg was not like any animal I had ever seen. And again, it was long like a human, but it didn't seem to have any pants or anything like that. I felt like I was meant to see what I saw, almost like a little nudge and a wink that something else was there with me and that it knew I saw it. Not jumping to any conclusions, but I am open to discussion if anyone has experienced something similar. My encounter with a tall gray being. I could write a novel about all of the experiences I've had with spirits, UFOs, etc., but I want to write about one particular encounter I had with a tall gray. It happened about 10 years ago when I lived in Beaumont, Quebec. It's a large wooded area, a 2-minute walk to the lake. It was nighttime. I'm talking with a friend on the phone outside on my balcony on the 2nd level. I reach over for a lighter on the table, and there he was in the field, standing there staring at me with his big black eyes, a light-colored, very tall, and lean being. I froze, and at that moment, a knowing came over me, that he knew that I saw him. He then ran fast in the field towards his left, stopped and looked at me again, then ran behind a bush. I could see some of his light-colored outline through the bush. I knew he was staring at me. I found myself repeating "Omg, Omg." My friend asked me what was wrong a few times and that if I didn't tell her, she was going to call the police. I forced myself to tell her that I would call her tomorrow, and I hung up. I needed to get in the house, So still being in shock, I went in. My fiancé at the time looked at me and asked immediately what was wrong. He could obviously tell something had happened. It felt like an eternity to tell him what just happened. I was still in shock. He told me that we would go look in the field the next day for evidence. The only thing I remember after is going to bed, which was on the main floor, thinking/imagining his face looking through my window, then falling asleep. The next morning, as we both stepped out of the house, I told him quite a few times as we were walking, pointing in the field, where this being was, where he ran, where he stopped, and where he hid. Sure enough, there's a path in the long grass. We follow the path, not walking directly in it, and sure enough, behind that bush where he hid, there was a padded down mini crop circle. It's the best way I can describe it. We keep looking around, and there are a few broken trees lying down, with fresh holes in the trunk, like if it were carved. I went back to the house while my ex stood about where I first saw the being. I compared the height. My ex is 6 tall, this being was a lot taller. My ex ran to the bush so I could compare how fast he was being run. My ex ran slow compared to the being. We both went in the house, and that was it. This encounter has confirmed to me that they exist, whoever they are. I don't believe they exist, I know they do. Last year I called a hypnotherapist and told him what happened because I was contemplating getting some regression done. He says to me, "Are you sure you want to do this? Some things are better to be left alone." I decided to leave it be. I recently moved to Weed, California, a small town next to Mount Shasta, for work. I'm an avid hiker and love exploring, so naturally 2 days ago I decided to go hike the mountain on one of my days off. I'm not entirely sure why, but I decided to drive my car very deep into the forest surrounding the mountain's base, as far as the dirt road would allow. It was around 3 p.m. with a clear sky, so I was very confident and enjoyed the scenery as I got out of my car and started my hike, heading closer to the mountain. At first, it was just your typical everyday hike, with plenty of birds and squirrels to be seen. That smell of nature that fills your lungs as you walk across the terrain. It wasn't until I reached a small, dried-up river that I noticed something was off. As I stopped to look at the dried-up river and take pictures, I noticed that it was strangely very quiet. No birds chirping, no signs of squirrels or other animals, and even the sound of the wind you hear when you're on a mountain seemed to be completely gone. At the time, I thought it was just an odd coincidence and started walking up alongside the river. But as I kept walking and being able to only hear my own footsteps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not the kind of feeling that makes you think someone is outside your window watching you. The kind of feeling that makes you feel multiple people or things are observing your every movement. Studying you. I've never had that kind of feeling in my life before. However, the events that followed caused me to completely forget about that feeling. I suddenly started to hear something out of nowhere that sounded like angelic humming, or maybe a song with no lyrics. But it also sounded strangely electric, like the sound telephone lines make. It wasn't very loud but enough to make me look in the direction it was coming from. I looked to the other side of the dried-up river that had multiple trees and other foliage to see someone or something looking straight at me. It almost looked like a ghost, with it looking completely white, not transparent though. But this thing was very clearly there. It almost looked like it was wearing a robe, but I couldn't see any feet, hands, or even a face. However, it had an oval head. However, I could feel it looking straight at me, almost as if it were trying to remember my every detail. Even from far away, I could tell that its entire body had a very weird texture, almost like porcelain, but if porcelain was a silky fabric. It was very obviously not human. I was very understandably in complete shock and terror. Frozen in place, I'm kind of scared. Our stare lasted what seemed like forever, but it was probably 20 to 30 seconds. I very slowly started walking backwards. I don't think I took more than 2 steps when it tilted its head, as if it was curious or even surprised at what I was doing. All the while I could still hear that electric angelic humming. And I swear it got a little louder when I took those steps back. When I turned my head to look behind me, to make sure the way was clear so I could run, the song suddenly stopped. Abruptly, without warning. This shocked me, and when I turned back to look at the thing, it was gone. No sign of it anywhere. As soon as I saw that it disappeared, I ran as fast as I could, following the path I took back. Even after it had disappeared and while I was running, I could still feel like I was being watched from all sides. I almost tripped a few times because of how fast I was going. When I got to my car, sounds of animals and the mountain wind suddenly came back, but I was still scared out of my mind and drove as fast as I could away from the mountain. I've never had anything paranormal happen to me before, and I've honestly always been very skeptical of stuff like that. But this experience has left me questioning a lot of things. I don't think I want to go back on that mountain. I've even had a nightmare about the experience. I'm not even sure what I saw or what to call it. My dad told me of his experience tonight. He was 20 years old at the time. This was mid-late 1980s. The night before the Utah deer hunt opened, he was driving to meet his family for a weekend of camping and hunting. It was late at night, and he was driving down a secluded 2-lane highway in Gunnison, Utah. He saw what he thought was a search and rescue helicopter off in the distance. It had a spotlight shining out of the bottom of it, and it was moving slowly in his direction. He pulled his truck over and sat on the hood of his truck to watch the helicopter. As the helicopter came closer, he realized that it was not a helicopter at all. It was an oval-shaped UFO. He said it was completely silent and had lights around the outside of it. The strangest part to him was the searchlight coming out of the bottom was not reflecting light past its borders. And it didn't touch the ground. The light cut off in a straight line at the bottom of the cone. He watched the craft for 3 to 5 minutes as it somewhat slowly came towards him, about 200 yards off of the ground. The craft and light came over the top of him, and the light did not illuminate him at all. The craft then shot off into the night sky like a shooting star. My dad was told by his family that he was white as a ghost when he arrived at camp later that night. My dad isn't into aliens at all and has only ever told a small handful of people about this experience. He doesn't have a clue what it was and has never seen anything similar again. Do with it what you will. I encountered a gray as a kid, alien, at least, that's what I can assume. I was somewhere around 9. It was the middle of the night, I can't say what time specifically, but it was a clear summer night, at the very least past 9 p.m. On my right was a mini forest that had long since been chopped down and transformed into an empty field, while on my left was the casino we were heading towards to reach the gas station in front of it. I was just sitting there in the middle of the back seat when I got this weird feeling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I turned around in my seat to look through the rear window, which was maybe 8 inches from me, and suddenly I was face to face with exactly what you imagine when you say alien, just a little paler. Its head was large, bigger than mine, and similar to an upside-down squash in shape. Its skin was very light gray. Each eye was massive, pitch black, and oval-shaped. I couldn't see a nose, but I'm fairly certain it had a small mouth, though I could be mistaken. It had a very skinny upper body, I couldn't see the rest of its body. It was past the window, with small, bony shoulders and ridiculously long hands that I swear looked like they were just morphing through the window like nothing was there, holding onto the back of the van. Maybe I saw that part wrong, maybe it was the angle as I was seated higher than it was standing, but my memory seems to insist it was gripping straight through it despite my instinct to say, of course it wasn't. I will never, ever forget looking into its eyes. It seemed to have no expression at all, but I could tell it was looking straight back into my eyes. I stared into the eyes of a creature I couldn't explain or prove the existence of. I was inches away from it. I might not have noticed it without the bright, close casino lights. Note, this thing somehow held onto the back of a moving van. We couldn't have been going more than 15 miles per hour at max because there was a stoplight coning up soon, but still, how did it hold on? How long had it been there? I looked back at my family to ask if anyone else saw it, and by the time I looked back to the window, it was gone. None of my family saw it. It wasn't a hallucination or my mind in the dark, it was very bright around the casino anyway, it is hundreds upon hundreds of bright lights all over, and I wasn't tired or dehydrated. I pressed my back firmly into the seat, trying to pretend I didn't just see what I saw, but the memory has stayed crystal clear, haunting my mind for well over a decade. I'm always hesitant to share this story because the creature's appearance is so predictable, but personally, I looked at that and thought everything was glowing, like I could see all the melting snow on the floor and all around the floor where my feet were. I thought it was crazy bizarre, so I looked up to my father to tell him, and he was looking straight forward, white-knuckling the steering wheel, and all around the vehicle there was a white light, not really blindingly bright, but like all the windows were frosted and it was daylight out. I kind of shouted, maybe more concerned than anything, Dad? I said this a few times, and then the light disappeared, and we were stopped just around the corner where his friend's headlights disappeared. He looked shocked and said, I think we lost Ron, let's turn around here and see what happened. We turned around at a field approach right after the corner and drove 5 minutes back to the lake, and his friend wasn't there. Then we drove home and his friend was there, the ice house was already backed into the spot next to our garage, and his friend seemed worried. The ice house was big and hard to back into the little spot with just one person, and Ron already had it in place, jacked up on blocks. He said he was coming to look for us since we were almost an hour late. Traveling back to the lake to look for his friend was only a 10-minute drive round trip. Pretty sure we all got abducted that night. A couple years ago, I went camping for my birthday with my boyfriend. This was around the time when the Mayweather vs. McGregor fight had been happening the night when we were up in the mountains. It was about 1 a.m., I don't remember, just know it was sometime pretty late where all the people on the campsite had already been asleep in their tents. We were laying there trying to get a good enough connection to watch the fight. While it was loading, I noticed a weird shadow outside of our tent. Mind you, there were no trees in this area we picked to camp in. I pointed it out to my boyfriend, he was weirded out like me. We tried to ignore it, and all of a sudden 4 human-like shadows were outside of our tent, touching and shaking it. My boyfriend opens up the tent and looks outside. There's nothing there. He has a flashlight and shines it around. Seeing nothing, we thought there had to be a logical explanation for it, so he just came back into the tent and once again just sat there and waiting for the fight to load on the phone, and as soon as he sat down onto our sleeping bag, it started happening again. 4 human-like shadows above and around our tent, moving it and shaking it literally sounded like wind, but there was none. We hid under the covers, hoping it would just stop. It stopped, but the 4 figures were still shadowing into our tent, so we decided to go outside together and walk to the car. We got outside and shined a light all around us, and nothing was there. We heard nothing walking away. There were rocks and dirt all around us, so you would hear someone walk off. There were no trees within feet of us. It was a pretty traumatic night. We still remember the outline of the figures and the noise around us. When we tell this story to anyone, I always feel like if somebody was telling me this story, I wouldn't believe them. Still not sure to this day what it was, it just gives us chills anytime we talk about it. Anybody ever had anything similar happen? This one is my dad's story. He was camping with 3 of his buddies in Colorado, circa 1977. They hiked all day, up steep mountain inclines, through rocky valleys, and across alpine fields. By sunset, they passed a field of sheep, thousands of them, and decided they would make camp on the other side of this field so that they could get a great view of the stars. That night, they made camp at 12,000 feet at Rollins Pass and had built a fire. My dad and his friends were sitting around it, taking turns drinking beer, telling ghost stories, and the like, when suddenly the sky lit up above them. My dad squints up, shields his eyes, and sees what appears to be a massive fireball headed in their direction. He and his buddies scream and scramble to their feet as the fireball hits on the opposite ridge with a loud, resounding boom. A shockwave rocks the canyon and knocks one of my dad's friends off his feet. Obviously, my dad and his friends are scared shitless. It's as if one of their ghost stories has just come true. His friend, White, wants to go and check it out, but the other guys are too freaked out to get up in the pitch black night to investigate. My dad convinces them to wait till morning. Needless to say, no one slept that night, or at least for very long. The next day, they packed up their camp and hiked to the other side of the ridge, just beyond Rollins Pass. White was the bravest of my dad's friends and decided to lead the way. As he passed over the rocky ridge to the other side, where the fireball had hit, he gasped and turned as pale as a ghost. My father jogged to catch up with him and stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the field that lay beyond. All the sheep, or what was left of them, lay scattered across the field. There was no blood. Just thousands of sheepskins, a few heads, and bones, as far as the eye could see, scattered across this field. Not a mark on the ground, no charred grass, nothing. Just dead sheep. My dad swore it was the creepiest thing he'd ever seen. His friends and he debated, on the hike down, what exactly killed those sheep? Aliens? A UFO? A lonely wolf? Oh boy. Here we go. This is going to be long and very hard to explain, and to clarify, I didn't think I was abducted, but my friend did. So, I was about 15. Every night, a guy I'll call Jay and I would sneak out at about midnight and go back home around 4 to 5 in the morning, before our parents would wake up for work. On one particular night, we had just snuck out, and it was about 1 a.m. We headed to my backyard, laid on the trampoline, and stared at the stars and talked, like we always did. Now, if you're in a room right now and you look around, you'll see the definite 4 corners where your ceiling and walls meet. You can see how. Square? They turn. Edge of wall, sharp turn, second wall, same with your ceiling. You can see each individual flat surface. The sky did that. It went from staring at the stars to looking like a cube of sky. From the southeast corner of the sky came this giant UFO. I mean huge. As if it took up a quarter of the entire sky. We both stared at it in dead silence. It didn't make any noise, even as it moved. And while it spun, it was only hovering straight. The spinning didn't move it like you imagine a frisbee doing. The sides just turned while it moved. I guess what it looked like doesn't matter. But Jay and I had our eyes dead set on it. We didn't say a word. We didn't point to show the other person. As it began to come toward us, we both flipped over. Again, no hints, no talking, no eye contact. In total sync, we flipped onto our stomachs and stayed as flat and quiet as we could. Now ducking from something sounds totally normal and instinctive, but that's not what this was. It was literally almost like telepathy. I can remember us having a mental conversation of stay flat and it won't see us. Don't move. We watch it make a weird, angled C shape across the sky. And although it felt totally in slow motion, it could have only been a few minutes because I think both of us held our breath the entire time. Now for the weirdest part, as soon as it was out of sight, boom, daybreak. We had literally just gotten to the yard, and I know it was 1:15 a.m. because I checked. But the minute we felt released from laying flat, it was very bright. Like 7:38:00 a.m. bright. I don't remember talking to him at all afterwards, other than making eye contact and then making a break for our homes before our parents noticed we weren't there. A few weeks, even months maybe, I'm talking to my brother's girlfriend about what happened. Apparently she's real into that shit, but also completely terrified. She said the fact that it felt like a few minutes but then it was suddenly 6 or 7 hours later truly, 100% makes her think we were abducted. She was serious. I made a joke about how I should go to hypnotherapy to unblock the memories, and she deadpans and says, "Don't. People who were abducted are traumatized by what happened to them. They even get PTSD." The next day she texted me about how she couldn't sleep. I think abduction is a little bit of a stretch, and she watched too many Discovery Channel documentaries, but the weird loss of time still irks me. I do know what we saw was 100% real. Aliens? I dunno. Abduction? I dunno. Blue light shining through window south of Richmond, Virginia. In December 2018, my ex-fiancée and I encountered this situation. For context, I grew up and still live in the country on a 60-acre plot of heavily forested land east of Pocahontas State Park but west of the nearby Army base. I know what things in the sky are supposed to look and sound like. I grew up running around the woods barefoot, cowboy camping in our woods, you name it, I did it. I'm no stranger to nature and the night sky. The house itself is on a hill, the only road that goes past it passes by the front of the house, and even then it's set back far from the road. The closest houses are a quarter mile away from us and across a deep creek. This is all relevant. My ex was visiting me from South America during the holidays. My bedroom window didn't have any blinds or curtains because, 1, I didn't need them, 2, no one could see into my room. I didn't have any intention of having them. We have no immediate neighbors. The way my bed was situated was that it was pushed up against the corner of my room, with the window to the right of the bed. We got ready for bed and slept naked because we're adults, and that's what we did. He had his back facing the wall, and my back was facing the window. As we're about to close our eyes, a bright blue light shone directly through the bottom corner of my window right onto us for a few seconds, then it disappeared. He got up screaming, "What the hell was that? Oh my God, what the hell was that?" I had this feeling of dread consume me. Told him, "Honey, get back into bed. Don't look at it. Don't acknowledge it. We're going to stay here for a bit, then get up slowly, don't look at the window, we're going to go to my living room, which is centrally located in the house and has no windows, and sleep on the couches. Just, don't do it now." We went to the living room, but we couldn't sleep until the sun came up. That next evening we went outside with 8 different flashlights, ranging from a cell phone to a handheld spotlight. There's an AC unit under my window, but you've got to have some serious determination and upper body strength to pull yourself up on it, and even then you're bound to cut your hands on it. There were no footprints on top, no handprints indicating that someone had pulled themselves onto it. Even worse, none of those flashlights replicated what we saw. My window is 12 feet off the ground. We aren't on speaking terms, but I know if I were to ask him about it today, he would definitely still vividly remember it. We had no explanation for what we saw. I was so horrified by this experience that I covered my window day and night with blankets for a year until I was able to afford high-quality room darkening curtains. This isn't the most frightening story. We didn't see any figures, no crafts, nothing like that. But we have no idea what we saw. Someone couldn't have climbed a tree even if they wanted to. All of the trees by my window are a decent 100 feet away at least and are super old and very tall walnut and oak trees with no low-hanging branches. There was no sound, no humming, no tapping, no clicking. It was silent. If anyone here happens to live in the area around where this happened and you've had similar experiences, I'd love to hear about them. I wasn't abducted, from what I remember, but I used to have a crippling fear of an alien invasion when I was a kid. I used to watch the skies from my window like a hawk each night, looking for the smallest strange thing to pop up. I always had an interest in the night sky ever since I was 4 or 5 and walking home with my aunt one night when we saw a large, misshapen white sphere in the sky. It was like the moon but smaller, more bright, and lumpy, and the actual moon was just a few feet away from it. I was really young, and even with my generally vivid memory, it is still very blurry. However, this sticks out in my mind because I remember my aunt commenting on how weird it was and rushing us home. But also later in my life, in early high school, I was walking home from a friend's house and looked up to marvel at the stars when I saw this large blue orb among the smaller white specks. I remember my first thought was, it's finally happening. I am finally seeing something ducked up in the sky, but right as I was finishing that thought, the orb blew up in a cosmic explosion of blue and green, in a way I can only describe as something you'd see on Star Trek. I immediately started running home, and I was a chubby teen, so I did not run for nothing. I burst into my front door, absolutely bawling my eyes out, screaming about the alien invasion I've always feared was finally among us. I never heard anything about it after that night. Nothing on the news, and no one in my area ever mentions seeing it when I bring it up. Then last year I went camping out in the Crownlands in Muskoka, and if you've ever been in a place with very little light pollution, you know how stunning the sky can be. I was down by the water, probably just after midnight, and was gazing up at the stars when I saw one speedy little white light moving straight across the sky. The place I was camping in wasn't a stranger to planes flying overhead, so I wasn't immediately taken aback, although I was wondering why there was no noise and no other lights like the other planes had, not to mention it was going rather fast and seemed much higher than a plane would be. I was with my friend at the time and jokingly raised my flashlight to the sky and turned it on and off, signaling whatever was up there. The second I did this, the light took an incredibly sharp right turn and began coming back the way it came. I stress every time I tell this story that this sharp turn was faster than any plane or helicopter could accomplish. I slammed my flashlight at my side upon this sight and demanded my friend and I go back to our tent. She agreed, having also seen what I had seen and been unnerved. Funny enough, about a month later I was watching alien videos and came across a Canadian politician who stepped down and began focusing on UFOs after he experienced exactly what I experienced. In the same place, Muskoka. I still get nervous when I look up at the night sky nowadays. When I was 10 or 12, I can't remember exactly, I was at the beach in a family campground in Espírito Santo, Brazil. The place still exists. It is called Camping do Siri in the city of Maratizes. The campground is by the beach. Campers can access the beach through a gate. They had someone watching over the area every day until 11 p.m., when the campground quiet time starts. They also had a couple of light posts, and the light would hit the beach at a 45-degree angle, and this detail is important for what I am about to tell you. As a family camp, you'd return there every year and either meet some friends from last year or make new ones. What I am about to tell you was witnessed by me, a new friend of the same age, and 2 other people, teenagers as far as I remember. It was 11 p.m., clear skies, February. In Brazil, that's a summer night. It was one of those days when the moon was big, bright, and orange, hovering over the water. We went to the beach to see the moon, and once we got there, my friend started doing some religious reverence to the moon. It was something like a jump with one fist in the air and landing on his knees, as if you were celebrating a soccer goal. I found it weird, but whatever. As he was at it, the lights of the campground went out, the ones at 45 degrees, and the guard announced the beach would be unsupervised and we should go back to our tents. It was dark, and the only light was from the moon and the stars. We stayed for 5 more minutes, and then I told my friend we should go. The other 2 people were sitting down on the sand closer to the water, admiring the moon. When they realized we were going to leave, they got up and started walking towards the gate behind us, probably 10 feet away. It's hard to remember. Walking towards the gate back into the campground, my friend was on my left side. We were talking, and I asked about what he was doing. Then suddenly a beam of white/bluish light came down from the sky, perfectly at 90 degrees, and disappeared after a second or 2. It went as far up in the sky as I could see within my field of vision, but I did not look up. As you can imagine, we got scared AF. Turned back and asked the other folks, "Did you see this?" They said yeah, and we started running for our lives back into the campground. The next day I went around the area to find some source of light that could have caused it and found nothing. My friend was too scared to investigate. That was it. Have you seen or heard of anything similar? I'm still trying to figure out what that was, and lately I've been thinking about hypnotic regression to see if something else happened. I was about 8 or 9, and my mom tells me we are going on a day trip to meet her high school friend. Cool. I grabbed my Game Boy Advance because I know my mom's friend has kids my age and wanted to show them up in the racing game I had. I overheard this from my mom talking with her friend at her house. They told me to leave the room because they needed to talk about adult things. Little, innocent, curious me wonders what exactly are adult things that I can't hear? Were they going to throw some new juicy cuss words out? Well, mom's friend had a little girl who would sleepwalk at night. Started when they moved into their new house, Northern California. It was a suburban area, but not too suburban, a new neighborhood with a lot of empty homes and forest patches in between each community. She was about 4 years old, and they found her one night in the backyard just sitting there. After that incident, they decide they need to lock her in her room at night and bar up her windows so that she doesn't end up in the woods nearby or anywhere besides her room really. The story: mom's friend and husband wake up to a loud boom on the side of the house in the middle of the next night. I felt like something hit the house because everything shook. They check on their boys, they're good. They didn't hear anything and went back to sleep. They check on their daughter, unlock the door, and realize she isn't in her room. They start to freak out, then hear a knock at the door. They opened it. It's the effing sleepwalking 4-year-old daughter. They ask her where she's been, and she says with the men and points down the street. Pissed off dad sees 2 guys in coats walking down the street. He yells at them and starts sprinting at them. Mom's friend said the guys didn't react at all. Coat guys turn the corner, dad turns the corner, and they're gone. Mom and dad check the locks and windows. No tampering. They notify the police, who pretty much say there's not much they can do but will keep an eye out. Effin' sleepwalking 4-year-old daughter is fine. I'm not scared at all. Just tired and goes back to bed. After that, my mom didn't understand why I was scared as hell that night. She believes she was abducted but refuses to tell me what happened. Even my dad tells me that he can't tell me the story. Says it's for my mom to share if she wants it shared. But overhearing this when I wasn't supposed to hear it had me tripped out as a kid. I really don't know if I was abducted or not, but I witnessed something pretty unexplainable. My ex and I were driving out of my suburban neighborhood super late one night on the way to go eat Waffle House or something. As we're nearing the exit to my neighborhood, I look up into the sky, and we both notice these 3 really strange orange lights in a triangle formation. We then stop the car in the middle of the road to figure out what we're looking at. These lights didn't have the quality of lights you see emitting from a plane or a star. When you look at stars, they are so far away that they almost seem 2D. But somehow, these lights felt 3D. These lights were much bigger and seemed closer. Like high enough into the sky to be well above the trees but not above the clouds. And they were just floating there, not moving up, down, left, or right, but eerily still. I really don't know how to explain how still these things were, but it was unnatural, and I know that sounds stupid, but that's how it felt when I saw them, and I wish I could explain it better. But when I saw this, I was both mesmerized and sort of in shock. I've always been a UFO enthusiast, and I've always wanted to see something bizarre like this, and finally it was happening. I couldn't take my eyes off of what I was looking at, and I feel like I didn't for like an hour? I really don't know how much time passed, but it really did feel like an unnatural amount of time. Finally, these globes of light abruptly dissolved away. Kind of like they were sucked into a black hole or something. We break our gaze and look at each other, and my ex asks me if I just saw what she saw. And yeah, we couldn't come up with an explanation at all. To this day, no one believes me, and I don't care. I saw what I saw, and I'm now fully confident we're not alone. Well, I'll tell this story, but keep in mind I'm an atheist, so no, I give no credence to spiritual beings or anything of that sort. So, I'm sleeping on my father's futon in his living room. We lived in a double-wide trailer. Yes, I know trailer park abduction stories, and that was basically my room. It was really loud outside due to cicadas and general summertime bug noises, and I was having a very difficult time falling asleep. I feel like the AC isn't working at all, but it's definitely blasting ice-cold air out. My room is getting warmer and warmer, though. I start to sweat pretty bad, so I kick off the covers, and I'm just laying there staring at the ceiling when the noise stops. I don't mean the bugs stop making noise, I mean I go deaf. I sit up and call for my dad, but I don't even hear my own voice. It's so freaking hot in this room. I start to think if I should go wake my dad up. But I can't move. I'm sitting up with my back against the futon, and I want to stand up, but I'm afraid to do so. I'm just terrified, and I don't know why, so I sit there staring into the dark. Suddenly I think the door opens. I can't see it or hear it, but I feel it in my feet. I know what that feeling is. I'm sitting there staring into pitch black nothing, hoping that it's all in my head. This is a terrible dream. That's when I feel it, like one giant hand wrapping over my chest and yanking me off the futon. My hearing comes back, and I am screaming at the top of my lungs. My father is shaking me awake, and I'm halfway outside our front door. Neighbors came out, police got called, but there was no explanation for what happened. I had a bruise the size of a pumpkin on my chest for a few weeks that no one could explain. To this day, I have no idea what was real or was just a dream. I have no idea what I could have done to cause such a bruise. And that fear. I've never felt that way before or since. I just couldn't move. Anyway, that's my story. I saw a tall gray alien. This isn't my first encounter with those beings. I've had a few encounters with them so far, and it only left me confused and freaked out. My parents decided it was a good idea to send me off on a small vacation with my grandparents to Turkey. They thought it was a great idea to have myself relax after such a stressful year. I went to a doctor after my first experience, thanks to my parents, who only send me to a therapist to see if something is wrong with me. So far, no one believes me for what I've seen. But that doesn't stop me from believing it. My grandparents have this small house in a village. The next neighbor is kilometers away, which makes it almost impossible to visit someone else. However, there are barely any trees. It's always scorching around June, and sleeping at night seems way more difficult than anyone thinks. My grandparents were already sleeping, and since there was nothing to watch on TV, I decided to call an end to the day and sleep outside. Of course, I didn't actually go outside but used the balcony instead, as I did not want to wake up with a snake around me. Getting down from the balcony is just asking for broken bones. I grabbed some pillows and a few blankets after I turned the lights on. Sleeping in the dark isn't really something I enjoy a lot, not after the many experiences I've had. The light seemed more for my own comfort than anything else. But I already could feel something was off. It was suddenly colder outside than it was a minute ago, and this awful feeling of being watched started to make me paranoid. I quickly looked back inside, but I saw nothing and shrugged it off, thinking I was making myself paranoid. That was, at least, what I had really thought. Once my eyes traveled down to the garden. I saw something way too familiar. It was dark outside, but my eyes never betrayed me for what I've seen in the light I had. Below me stood a very tall, grayish-white tall gray. It was very tall and skinny. I'm not really sure how tall, but definitely taller than an average human. Its shoulders were very thin, and the arms reached its knees. But, to make it a bit clearer, it literally looked like those toys you could stretch, mostly their limbs. All it did was stare at me as I stared back at it. I'm not sure how long this had lasted, but when I blinked my eyes, the creature was all of a sudden a bit closer than it was before. That's when I knew that it knew I was there. I was frozen in fear, and the alien moved its head a bit to the side, only to move it back straight. As if it were curious to see me. After a bit, I finally got the courage to do something. Instead of freaking out like always, I thought it was a better idea to react calmly. The first thing I did was wave my hand slowly at it, only to have the same response back after a few minutes. As much as I did try not to freak out, I only became even more scared. I asked what it was doing here, but that was when I felt my whole body becoming stiff. My mind was telling me to scream for help, someone to come and take this creature away. I knew one thing for sure. It wanted something from me. Something I had no idea of what it could be. I asked the creature again why it was here and only got a reaction by moving its head a bit to the side, as if it were curious. The alien moved a bit closer, standing right underneath me, looking up at me with those big black eyes. I wasn't able to see a mouth before, but now I could. I was shaking in fear, wondering why it was standing this close. A loud voice of a man called for me, asking what I was doing on the balcony in the middle of the night. My eyes quickly moved to the police officer of the village, who was always driving around at night. However, once my eyes met the officer's, I quickly looked back down, only to see that the alien had disappeared. The officer saw how alarmed I was, as it was easy to see that I was shaking and nearly at the point of falling on my knees. All I did was say that something was in the garden, and that's when the officer quickly entered the garden to check if someone was there. However, he told me he saw nothing and called a few other officers to check the surroundings. My grandparents were woken up by them and told them what happened. However, my grandfather, who has a bit of an obsession with aliens, asked me many questions about the aliens I've seen. It seems like it isn't the first time this has happened at all and that it has been common in our family that encounters like this happen. But what I did learn was that my grandfather was, or still is, an abductee. I can't say I truly believe that it wasn't just my brain ducking with me, but this really stood out to me because of how ducking real it felt and how awake I was. Sure was neat, regardless. I was sleeping in my room, which I like to keep as dark as possible. I suddenly woke up to the sound of a loud pop, like a small firecracker. I looked out into the dark and thought, OSHT, was that the electrical outlet for my computer frying? I looked toward it, but I see nothing. I figure it was nothing, so I rolled onto my back to go back to sleep. I was very calm but pretty awake because of the little fire scare. I took a deep breath to try to hush away the small bit of adrenaline, and just as I was about to close my eyes, I saw a dark shadow above me. It seemed to be waving, and when I focused more, thinking that's odd, I realized it looked like a hand. It surprised me, and I kind of felt like it was just trying to get my attention. It straightened away from me, and then it leaned and pressed down on the edge of my bed, closer to my head. It did it 2 or 3 times, and I could very clearly feel the weight. I was just sort of stunned at this point. If it was my sister or mom, they would have said something, and when I'm nervous or scared, I tend to fall back to observation. I was pretty damn convinced that it was real at that point, but I didn't feel threatened, for whatever reason, and I got the feeling that he wanted to show me that yes, I'm really here. I saw him straighten up, and I tried to focus on his head to get a better look. It suddenly lit up, only for a second, but the image is burned forever in my memory. It's hard to describe how it looked. It was outlined in light of many colors, but it was also very faint. Greens, yellows, blues, reds, and purples all swirled together simultaneously, mixed all together yet very separate somehow. The brightness, I could relate to a glow-in-the-dark star sticker. Bright enough to see very clearly, but not so bright as to make me squint. He looked a bit like a reptile, sort of like a raptor, but with a larger, rounder skull. A strong brow ridge, and there were circle-type bunches all over his body, which I assumed were scales. His face was turned so that I saw a clear profile. It looked like he was wearing a loose, simple shirt of some kind, and he held something like a clipboard in one arm, and the other was held up to it, as if he were writing on it. But what I was looking at directly, and what I remember most of all, was his eye. That large, unforgettable eye. Circular pupil that was open somewhat wide. Lightly colored iris, almost cartoony in how simple it looked compared to the rest of him. I guess it felt so warm and personable, but it looked a little sad and maybe a bit stern. I tried many times to redraw it but failed to get the nuance just right. The light that outlined him flashed up so quickly and with so much detail that I felt a bit overwhelmed, and it was gone just as swiftly. I hadn't tried to move or speak, so I can't say if I was unable to do so. I could add even more ridiculous amounts of detail explaining this experience, but most of what I've left out is all very small and essentially meaningless. The craziest thing is that several months later, we noticed that a hawk caught a bird on our front lawn. We both thought it was really neat, so we watched it and tried to take pictures and such. When it flew back up to a tree, I watched it for a while longer. But then I saw his eye clearly, and it looked exactly like his eye. And I mean spot ducking on. That weirded me out a bit, but it was still neat. Alien abduction. Mom and daughter. So my story begins in 1989-90, when I was around 9 years old. I lived in a little neighborhood that was surrounded by forest and swamp. This neighborhood was popular for young families with kids, so I had many friends. Well, there was this scary story passed around by some of the kids about the black man that would come out of the woods at night and take kids. Well, 9-year-old me automatically thinks a black guy in a van driving around stealing kids, which scared the shit out of little kid me. We moved out of the area in 1991, and I was quick to forget the story of the black man. Fast forward to 2006. I am married and have 7-year-old and 3-year-old daughters. My husband was working down by the neighborhood with the black man, so I suggested we move there. Now the story of the black man was one of those memories filed away and forgotten. So the house we move into is backed up to the still desolate woods. I had so many good memories living there that I was excited for my kids to get into the same mischief that I did. Well, the first night we moved in, my husband and I slept on a futon in the living room. I had a very vivid surreal dream that I woke up and stood up facing the laundry room. Now remind you, we're backed up to nothing, so it is pitch black outside, but the laundry room was lit up brightly from its tiny little window. And standing in the doorway is this completely black figure with longer arms who looked almost hunched over slightly. Now in my dream, I wasn't scared, but almost telepathically, the being said, "Okay, lay down," which I did. I laid down, and the next thing I know, I am waking up the next morning. The next morning I was disturbed by the dream but convinced myself it couldn't be anything else but a dream. I told no one and filed it away. Fast forward again to 2015, and my sweet little 7-year-old is now a 16-year-old hormonal mess. Me and my husband were watching paranormal shit on TV and ping 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 core memory trigger. I start to tell him about that disturbing dream as a joke, like, haha, I met an alien. As I am telling him, my 16-year-old cuts me off and starts to describe him in the backlighting to a ducking tea. She said the first time she saw him, she was getting a drink of water and the laundry room lit up, and he was there. She dropped the glass, and the next thing she remembers is waking up. She thought she was just having nightmares, until we moved and they stopped. I literally started crying. A few days later, after going over this shit a million times, I remembered the story of the black man. Now I joke about our possible abductions, because if I don't laugh, I may freak the duck out. I've had many encounters, though it may all just be in my mind. They started when I was a young boy living on a lake in northern Michigan. I remember so clearly looking over the lake at night and seeing lights zipping around in the distance faster than any airplane could. Flights seldom passed by us anyway, we were in the middle of nowhere. It always made me uneasy just looking at them, and then one winter night it happened. I went to bed, and suddenly I found myself in an unlit coat room getting dressed to go outside. I wandered down the 100-yard hill to the shoreline, lit only by pale blue moonlight reflecting on the snow. I remember the cold piercing through my pajama bottoms as I walked. I stood at the base of our dock, everything still and quiet like it gets when everything is covered in deep snow. The monochrome woodline lined the snowy blue expanse of the lake. I wondered why I was standing there when I looked up to see a black shape passing against the clouds in the distance. It hovered silently straight to the center of the lake and stopped dead. I could tell it had seen me, at least it knew I was there. I just sort of felt as if it was looking at me. Panicked, but before I could turn and run, a violet pulse of light lit up every visible surface for what seemed like miles. I slammed my eyes shut and scrambled blindly up the icy hill as fast as I could manage. I made it about 60% of the way before I stumbled face first into my footprints from earlier, and as if falling through the snow, I shot up out of bed drenched in sweat and fearing to look outside. It was a typical gray winter morning, but it just felt off. Like I was being watched constantly, and I didn't dare go to the dock. There were indeed footprints leading up and down the hill, but that wasn't necessarily proof of anything, since we often used each other's footprints when walking down to ice fish or walking up from sledding. After that night, springtime and summer were the only seasons I felt comfortable outside there. Something about the leaves obscuring the overhead view sort of took my mind off of that being alone, but not alone feeling. I've got many more if you want them, this is getting long-winded. When I was about 12, my family bought a fishing cabin by a small river about 70 miles from our home. On our first visit to stay in this cabin, it was kind of a work vacation, meaning we were painting and fixing and stuff as well as fishing. One of the people who lived near this cabin came over to say hi and introduce herself. During the course of her visit, she told us, "Don't be afraid of the purple glowing mist you will see. It's just the UFO, and it won't hurt you." All of us kids snickered at this while elbowing each other, so my mom chased us off and apologized to the woman. She later yelled at us for being rude. 2 nights later, we were out night fishing with our dad. The stars were amazing looking without the city's light pollution, and we were all pointing at different constellations and challenging each other to name them. My youngest brother pointed to a perfect circle of about 7 bright stars and asked, "What are those called?" We all kind of froze and stared because, well, there is no such constellation, yet here it was. While we were looking at it, all the stars took off silently in different directions and vanished over all the surrounding horizons. We ran. Looking back, it was stupid to run. I mean, the things were already gone. But we were spooked, and we ran as fast as we could back to the cabin where Mom was sleeping. About halfway there, our dad overtook us and ran straight into the cabin ahead of us, slamming the door. When we got in the cabin, he told us, "Just shut up and go to bed." He sounded angry, so we did just that. The next morning at breakfast, when we tried to talk about it, Dad angrily said that he didn't remember any of that and to stop with the stupid stories. My sister asked, "Why did you run then?" He said that he was tired and wanted to get to bed was all. He was tired so he ran? My dad could be a real goober sometimes. This wasn't the only time we saw things in the sky while staying there, but it was the most interesting. We tried on a few occasions to get pictures, but it was the early 60s and cameras sucked half the time back then. At least the cheap kid cameras we had did. We were afraid to ask to use Dad's good camera for that. We only had that cabin for a few years when my dad suddenly sold it. We never could get him to talk about that night. He would firmly deny it every time we tried. Although we looked for it, we never saw the purple glowing mist. Alien abduction phenomenon in Virginia. This story is true and takes place in 2012 within Stafford County, Virginia. I was 22 years old at the time. Late one night I received a call from my friend T asking me to hang out. It was 10:30 p.m. It wasn't unusual to start our night this late. We barely slept most nights anyway. It was a fairly uneventful but fun night. After some Bud Light Platinums and a few hours of video games, I was worn out and ready to go home. I lived within 2 miles of T and felt totally comfortable driving home. I said goodbye and left his place at 2:15 a.m. I made my way home, enjoying the winding and bending of the roads. Stafford County contains many backcountry roads with hairpin curves. The roads were completely empty at this time. As I made my way around a curve, I slammed on the brakes and came to a screeching halt. This is when things would start to become very strange. About 15 to 20 feet out in front of me are deer. A large number of deer. I never counted, but there were easily 30 to 40 of them. I had never seen so many deer in one place. I was amazed. Some were lying down on the road with their front and back legs tucked under themselves. Whereas others were just standing around. All were blocking the road. I tried honking my horn. Nothing. Not a single movement from the deer. Then, I noticed something that really disturbed me. The deer were staring at me. Not only that, but I hadn't seen a single one move a muscle. Not even a twitch or a single blink. I felt the blood rush to my face as I realized something just wasn't right here. It was deeply unsettling. I tried yelling out the window at them. Nothing. I tried more honking and even turned the music up as loud as it would possibly go. Still nothing. Just a blank, still, and black-eyed stare. I began to get very impatient about this whole thing. I figured deer were scared of people. I'll get out and walk toward them. They will eventually get up and run. I will admit, I was starting to get scared, but I couldn't reason with the feeling. Why am I scared? It's only deer, I remember thinking. But I knew something just wasn't quite right. This wasn't normal at all, and I knew it. I get out of my car anyway and leave the door ajar. But before I could do anything, a wave of dizziness and nausea hit me incredibly hard out of nowhere. I held on to the side of the car for balance. I remembered thinking maybe it's the alcohol. But there was no way. I only had 3 beers or so in a time period of about 4 hours. I continued to lean against the car with my body facing away from the deer and began to vomit. I threw up maybe 3 or 4 good times. I threw up until there was nothing left. I noticed the vomit had a strong metallic taste or smell. Gross. After a few deep breaths, the intense nausea and dizziness started to subside. I recovered my composure and turned around. The deer were gone. But I never heard or saw anything move. I quickly looked around. I looked toward the road and the trees, then back to my car. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Everything was silent and dark. I got back into my car and started the engine. I drove quietly with no music all the way back home. My thoughts were racing, and I didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I didn't feel right at all. When I got home, I pulled straight into the driveway. The house was dark, and everyone was still asleep. When I got out of my car, I lit a cigarette before going back into the house and reaching for my phone to browse the news or Facebook out of boredom. My phone was turned off. I never turn off my phone. When my phone loaded back up, more questions arose. My weather application had weather updates based off a location from somewhere in Maine. I wasn't in Maine. I've never even been to Maine. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The time was 4:40 a.m. A 2-minute car ride was somehow over 2 hours long. To this day, I have no clue what happened. The loss of time with the events that transpired makes completely no sense. Every search on the internet leads me back to alien abduction. I guess I will never truly know what happened to me here. Something weird is going on in Western NC. 1. A couple of months ago, a thunderstorm woke me up at 4:55 a.m. It was a particularly powerful one. I peeked outside, and as it was lightning and thundering and generally just coming down hard. I found it strange that I was awoken since most of the time I sleep through storms, but I realized why I was awoken about 5 minutes later. There suddenly was a weird sound that began. It was almost like something seemed to be building a charge during the storm, like it was a static sound and then a charging sound and then almost like an arc or something. We began, me and my wife, hearing this what we can only describe as a building up of static charge that would build then release, build then release. It was very strange. I looked to see if I could see anything, and across the valley on the mountain range across from us, I could almost swear I saw something in the clouds when it lit up with lightning, but then it was gone. The next bright flash of lightning, after about 15 to 20 minutes, stopped, and after it stopped, so did the whole storm. I thought it was weird but believed maybe it's just a really big storm. Instance 2, a few weeks later, my dog woke me up at 3 a.m. He normally sleeps through the night, but I figured maybe since he was up in age, going on 13, he couldn't wait and wanted to go out, so I let him. This morning it was cloudy but not storming, and I walked my little dog outside and was looking out around the sky. It was quiet, but then I heard a weird whooshing noise, and without thinking much, I looked up, saw nothing, then looked back, and my dog was staring straight up at me. It's pitch black and I can't see anything, but I felt an ominous feeling, so I quickly ran him back inside, brushed it off as paranoia, and went to bed. Instance 3, random power outage of the whole city. No explanation about 3 days ago. Everyone lost power, no real explanation given, but it was a clear day about 4 p.m. and suddenly everything just turned off. I didn't think it was weird until I started adding all this together, and it might be irrelevant, but being the whole city losing power is odd, especially for my little town. Instance 4 last night. Last night my dogs began whining at midnight, and I decided to take them out. This time I take my big dog and small older dog out to walk around the backyard, and our porch light is burned out from the power outage the other day. I'm in pitch black darkness when I notice something catch my eye. It's a light that seems to be hovering over a nearby mountain. Then several lights start coming up from the mountaintop and going to the light that's hovering. It appeared to consume the orbs of light, and I stood there dumbfounded thinking I was imagining things, and of course I did not have my phone, so I run back inside and grab my iPhone and run back outside, and the only picture I could get was a terribly blurry picture with just a light. I tried recording, but it was pitch black because the light was so far away. I then watch as the last small light goes to the other brighter light, is seemingly consumed, joins, and then almost instantaneously the white light zips directly up and disappears into the sky. I don't know what I saw, but did anyone else notice anything strange the last few weeks in the western North Carolina area? I'm about 15 minutes from Cherokee and about an hour west of Asheville. This isn't making sense to me, and I am generally confused. They often fly military training operations over our area, but this wasn't anything like that. I am hesitant to share this because it seems silly, but perhaps there is a logical explanation? When I was younger, around 10 years old, my family all went camping at this campground in Worcester, TWP, Maryland. We would always go to this campground and would get the same site that was in this open area that hardly had any trees but rested on a bay on the inside shore of Maryland. Anyways, one evening my dad and I were outside of our RV setting up outdoor furniture. I specifically remember how clear that night was and how there were zero clouds in the sky, so you see a decent amount of stars. While we were looking up at the sky, we saw this red light that almost looked like an orb appear above the bay. At first we thought it was a flare because that's seemingly what it looked like. However, there was no arch to it, just a red dot that didn't move. After around a few dozen seconds, the one red light turned into two and then eventually three, all in the shape of a triangle. My father and I just sat there and watched as these three red dots then started to move in a direction from the bay towards the campground where we were. The triangle didn't exactly move fast, but it didn't exactly move slow. The triangle was over top of us in the campground, and we just sat there for a few seconds until all three red lights went out simultaneously, like someone turned off a light switch. After the lights went out, I ran inside to my grandparents' RV, where I found my mom, brothers, and grandparents all playing a card game. When I told them what my father and I saw outside and how it had to be a UFO, they all gave me weird looks as if I were crazy. After going back outside to find my father, I found him talking to one of the security guards that was driving around to sites to check on people due to others seeing mysterious lights in the sky. It's one of the weirdest things that I have ever encountered, and I was wondering if anybody had similar stories. Certainly made me believe more in aliens. High strangeness / extremely close UFO encounter. I'm a 32-year-old man from and currently live in Cumberland County, New Jersey. This happened in October of 2018. It was about 11:45 at night, and I decided to go on my front steps to smoke a couple of cigarettes before I tried to fall asleep. Everybody else in the house was already sleeping. It was a pretty clear night without many clouds in the sky, but there was some fog on the ground. As I was smoking, I was looking at the fog, and to me it looked like there was movement in it. I know it sounds crazy, but it was almost like there were invisible / camouflage things out there that I wouldn't be able to see if it wasn't for the fog hanging on the ground. As I was looking at the fog, I noticed this white truck that had driven by twice at this point. I could hear a woman and man yelling at each other when the truck stops at the stop sign in front of my house, and the woman gets out screaming at the man, then slams the door as he pulls off fast, then proceeds to walk into the woods across the street from me, which is really weird because there isn't anything back there except for blue holes until you hit the bay. If I walk out of my front door and just keep walking straight, there won't be any houses or civilization at all, only trees and artificial lakes, blue holes, left over from sand plants until you hit the Delaware Bay. So at this point it's been about 5 minutes since the woman walked into the woods when things started going from weird to absolutely unbelievably scary, strange, and the most reality-shattering thing that has ever happened to me. I'm still looking at the movement that I'm seeing in the fog when I hear this very loud noise come from the woods that sounded like metal being ripped apart. There really isn't a good example I can give for that sound because it was so unearthly. I'm sure it wasn't a natural sound. That sound lasted for about 10 to 15 seconds, then abruptly stopped and was replaced with a different sound, which I could feel more than I could hear. Imagine being aware that there's a huge sound happening by you but is out of the frequency that your ears can hear. That's the best way I can describe it. This sound is a constant through the rest of this experience. This is the point where I will probably lose some people, and I'm aware of how crazy this all sounds, but as I'm getting adjusted to the sound, right after I notice the light in the sky is when I start to get really freaked out more than I've ever been in my life. In the woods across the street from me, which is no more than 50 yards, all these orbs of light start to appear. I could see some that seemed to flicker into existence. These orbs were all white light, which didn't light up the area around them like what you would expect from flashlights. There were probably about 12 to 16 of them, and they moved in a totally smooth manner. Besides the trail to get into the woods, the area is so dense and invested with stickerthorn bushes that it simply wouldn't be possible for people to move where the lights were moving, let alone do it completely smooth. I really am positive that they weren't people with flashlights because of the area and the characteristics of the light orbs themselves. So I'm just watching the orbs move around for about a minute, trying to make sense of what it is I'm seeing when I look back up to the sky to find a craft coming practically right towards me with it only being about 1,000 yards away at this point. So I'm going back and forth looking at the orbs on the ground and the craft, which I start to make out better. It was flying very low, I'd say it was only about 3.5 to 4 stories off the ground. I see the path it's taking and see it's going to pass right in front of me at an angle in which I'll be able to see underneath the craft and the side of it at the same time. The craft was a single-story dull black rectangle. I could see underneath the craft and saw that the rectangle was made up of 3 smaller rectangle panels that fit together to form a larger rectangle. I clearly saw that the craft was made up of 3 panels. The size is a harder estimate, but I would say it was about 35 yards long and 20 yards across. Underneath, there were lights flashing in a pattern that would cycle through, then cycle back the other way. At the moment, I thought that the craft was signaling to the orbs on the ground. It didn't make any sound at all, and all I was hearing was the same buzzing/humming noise that I felt more than I heard. While it was in front of me, it was moving really slowly, to the point where I don't think a plane with a normal propulsion system could even stay in the air at that speed. I take my eyes off the craft and look back down at the orbs, which are still moving all around, though one was starting to cross the street in front of me. I only took my eyes off the craft for a moment when I looked at the orbs, but when I looked back, the craft was gone. For whatever reason, when I saw the craft just vanish like that, the reality of what I was seeing really hit home, and I got scared, to be honest with you, since my daughter, wife, and mom were all no more than 50 feet away from all of this craziness I was watching, so I went inside and locked the doors. I just felt like I'd be willing to investigate more if it was just my life I was playing with, but I wasn't willing to take that chance with my family lives. I could have just been paranoid at this point, but I felt like I was being watched for the next 2 hours. I didn't have any lost time from this event, and the entire thing happened only over a period of 20 to 30 minutes. Go back on the event now, I question what exactly was going on with the white truck and the woman who walked into the woods at the beginning of this post. I've also done some research and found that there are a good number of reports of people seeing a glimmering man in the woods, which makes me think of the movement I was seeing in the fog. Where I live is a very active area for UFO phenomenon, which makes sense if something wanted to have access to major cities like Philadelphia, NYC, Baltimore, and DC. What could possibly be a better place to hide than the almost inaccessible 1,000-foot deep lakes in the middle of the woods? I know this is a very long one, but I wanted to be as detailed as possible. I'd really like to hear what you all think about this and if anybody has had a similar experience or knows somebody who has. Thanks for listening all the way to the end of this. I remember a time when I was around 8 or 9 where I had some recurring nightmares of hooded figures coming into my room and looking over my bed and poking me with their fingers or some sort of instrument. It's a simple nightmare that could easily be explained away by my parents checking on me or cutting my toenails while I'm asleep because I was probably a gross kid, but it's the only nightmare or dream I've ever had that I can still vividly remember. Around the same time I was having those nightmares, a few chickens started turning up dead in our chicken coop. I remember the dinner table conversations with my family. I wonder what got em. I didn't see any tracks. Maybe it was a raccoon? Raccoons aren't hardcore predators like that. A fox? There's no place for a fox to get in and out, and I didn't see any tracks. Maybe it was a possum. My dad tried to shield me from seeing the gore, but because I was a persistent and curious kid, I was able to get a good look at one of the corpses. I was too young to understand then and just dismissed it with the same question the rest of my family asked. What sort of animal feeds like that? Now that I'm older, I understand, and I don't think any animal feeds like that. The rear of the chicken had been sliced clean off, and its organ cavity had been completely scooped clean all the way to the rib cage. There was no sign of struggle, no blood splatter or feathers strewn about, and the eye sockets looked like they had been burned, cauterized. We lost 3 or 4 chickens that way, all the same, surgical precision, organs, and eyeballs removed. Over the course of a couple weeks, my parents decided it was a possum, buried the corpses, and we all went on with our lives. Except on the Sunday after all that, as I'm getting ready for church, I was getting really frustrated with my hair. Mind you, it was the mid-90s and I was a kid, so my bowl cut was normal, except that day it wasn't cooperating in the front and leaving a big gap exposing my forehead. I complained to my mom, and I remember her being angry with my brothers, thinking somebody had cut my hair while I was sleeping. They denied it, and my mom redid my hair so it wouldn't look so goofy, and we went on with life. Until later on, when I discovered a tiny scar on my scalp in the exact position where the gap was on my forehead when I had a bowl cut. I've never had an injury or surgical procedure that would leave a scar like that. That's when everything started making sense. I used to love watching dumb, sensational UFO specials on the History and Discovery Channel as a skeptic, only to realize that something weird happened to me personally. So, there you have it. I have no other way to explain this strange series of events from my childhood. Around early June, I went to a campsite in Divide, Colorado, with my girlfriend's family. It was my first time camping, 20-yo, and there were about 25 of her family members there. I was originally going to drive back down to CO Springs because I just wanted to go for a few hours. However, I decided to drink a little. Fast forward to the fun part. It was around 11 p.m. and everyone was having fun and drinking, though it's not like we were getting shit-faced, just having a good time. We decide to stay away from RVs and lights so we can look at the stars. We hang out in the woods for a bit, and we aren't really looking up anymore until one of my girlfriend's cousins says, "Hey guys, look at that star." All 6 of us that were out there look up, and we all see the same thing. A star brightening up only to have it spill in 3, of which all 3-point stars move counterclockwise away from each other in a rather spiral path. I'm trying to explain this as best as I can. All 6 of us saw the same thing. A few ran back to the camp, but I stayed out in awe. I looked for what feels like 5 minutes, and they are still there, moving here and there, and then stopping in place for a moment. My girlfriend and I return to the campsite and grab other people to come and look. We all lay on the ground and start watching the sky. There are stars everywhere, but only these 3 remain, bright and moving. Then we see more coming in all directions, moving, disappearing, glowing, and even changing directions. I was not drunk, none of us were, and we try to record, but our cameras can't even focus on the moon. This was 45 minutes of watching stars behave the way they shouldn't. I have the app Heavens Above to see if any satellites would be visible. None were passing overhead. I looked at air traffic websites, and there were no planes in the area at that time. Plus, this was still during the closure phase of my state. I doubt there could have been that many planes up in the sky. And even if there were, that doesn't explain the constant 90 degrees turns or complete turnarounds of the objects. This was my first time ever seeing anything like this. I was super excited, and I still think about that night, hoping that they heard/felt us and said, "Let's give these guys a show." What do you guys think? When I was young, the neighborhood kids used to play dark hide and seek or dark capture the flag, often pretty late at night. Our parents were okay with it as long as we didn't leave the neighborhood. It was the early 90s, we were basically thrown out of the house on the weekends. Anyway, one night after the game was over and everyone had gone home, my stepsister and I were hanging out in our front yard, just sitting on one of those green cable boxes and talking. At one point she stops talking and points into the sky and asks about a light in the sky. I turn and look and see it myself. The light was faint blue and was brighter and bigger than the stars around it. It was moving in ways that seemed impossible, and it became aware we were looking at it as soon as I locked eyes on it. I don't know how to describe that I know that. It was just this immediate feeling that it was looking right back at us. Suddenly, the light moved towards us almost in the blink of an eye. It went from being roughly double the size of a star in the sky to as bright as an airplane or helicopter searchlight instantly. There was no sound, and the light didn't illuminate the surrounding area, which gave it a weird feeling. I tried to say something to my sister, but I found myself unable to speak, and I could suddenly barely move. I just reneged, turning my head to see my sister looking very scared and also unable to speak or move. I thought I heard a noise, and the light started shining on me, which made me turn my head back towards the object, and then I felt a piercing light basically blind me. I was like bathed in the blue light. After this, things get a bit hazy, as if I was meant to not remember it, even though certain moments are as plain as any memory from that time. I was in a place that was mostly dark, but there were lights that seemed to hover by themselves, with no visible technology, poles, etc. holding them up. I don't know if I was lying down or standing up because there was a feeling of no gravity or downward force in any direction. I remember interacting with an entity that was humanesque but seemed to be different, like a beautiful person, but they had no male or female characteristics, were completely androgynous, but had a very symmetrical and smooth appearance to the face and body. Otherwise, very human looking. They talked to me, but I was acutely aware that it was in my head and not out loud. It was like moments of being conscious with moments of haziness in between. I don't know how to describe it. I was aware that they were doing things to me, but I don't remember what, but I do distinctly remember a piercing device they inserted just behind my ear on my right side. It went pretty deep, but it didn't hurt, it just felt almost itchy for a second, and they told me they were taking a sample and depositing something that would allow them to remotely monitor me for some time. They explained that this was not the first time they had done this to me, and that they would continue to do so throughout my life, and that there were literally thousands of people they were doing this to. It was a scientific study of some kind that they tried to explain to me, but I honestly don't remember the purpose. I was able to ask them a few other things in the moments of being conscious, like where my sister was, and they explained she was having the same thing done to her. I asked them point blank if they were aliens, and they found it humorous and told me they were humans from the future, but I got the distinct feeling that this wasn't the truth. Again, I don't know how to describe why I thought this, it was just a different feeling when they told me this versus the other things they were saying. It felt like a lie or simplification of some kind. After some time of being out of it again, I became aware that my body was bathed in blue light again, and the darkness started to recede, and I was able to see the stars and the sky again. I don't know how long it was before I really understood where I was, but at some point I sort of came to and realized I was sitting on the grass, next to my sister, in the neighbor's yard about 50 to 60 feet from the original spot. My sister came to almost at the same time. We both immediately looked at each other and then at the sky, and the light was gone, but the sun was coming up. It was then we realized it had been hours. We didn't really talk about what happened, we just felt the need to go inside and go to bed before we got in trouble. It was years later before I ever spoke to my sister about that night, and she remembers much less than I do. She remembers seeing the light, being blinded by it, and then feeling weird, and then waking up beside me. To this day she has explained it away by us seeing a helicopter in the sky and just falling asleep because we were tired. She won't discuss it beyond that. I honestly had forgotten about this event until 2 years ago when my wife mentioned that I had a spot behind my right ear that kind of looked like a burn mark or a scar but also like a pimple or mole. She likes to pop things and was dying to let her try to pop it. When she reminded me of it, the memories of the event flooded back into my head, and I was a bit emotional but agreed to let her mess with it. She tried to pop it but said nothing came out. It's still there and looks exactly as she describes it, kinda like a mole but also kinda like a scar. I've had MRIs and other scans throughout the years, but nothing has ever shown up, so I have no idea what it is or if anything is inside there. I try to not think of it now because, although I wasn't scared at the time, it is unnerving to think about now. That's my story, as honestly as I remember it. In honor of my grandfather, I want to share his story. This week marks the anniversary of the passing of both my father and my grandfather. I was thinking back on the good times we had, and I remember the story he would tell me of his experience with these beings, and I felt like I should share it as well before the memory fades on the details. The event happened, I'd say, around 25 to 30 years ago. My grandfather was in his 40s and was a truck driver in Puerto Rico in the United States. He isn't a skeptical UFO guy, nor is he crazy. This is the one and only experience he had. He was also religious but still believed in ETs. The location of his home is still there, but they turned the building next to him into a restaurant, so you can look it up to get an idea. The address of Ocean Food and Bar Car is 681 kilometers 9.8, located in Arecibo, 00612, Puerto Rico. The largest trench in the Atlantic Sea is the Puerto Rico Trench, and my gramps always told me, aliens are not in space, they are in the ocean with us. No one has fully explored the trenches, and it's too vast and deep that anything can hide down there. In his small farm home in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, he and his second wife, not my grandmother, woke up in the middle of the night with a light outside his window. He thought he forgot to turn off one of the lamps outside, so he looked through the window and saw some type of ship. The best way to explain is a large white golf ball shaped ship with 4 metal legs to hold the ship in place. It wasn't too big. Probably big enough to fit 4 to 6 average-sized humans with some extra leg room. What was interesting was the ship had the dents as a golf ball would have, as if to help withstand pressure or possibly aerodynamic. Maybe the ocean pressure, perhaps? Anyway, while Gramps was looking at this, one of the doors was open and had a ramp with 2 humanoid beings standing side by side looking towards him. He couldn't see the inside of the ship because, after that, he felt the presence of someone inside his bedroom. From the closet, 2 7 to 8 foot beings basically went through the closet as if it could move through walls. The description he gave was of 2 men in suits. Similar to Men in Black. Their faces were human looking other than the fact their noses were that of a fish nose. As he stood there frozen in fear, one of them approached him, and at that time, Gramps felt this mental calmness as if the being was telepathically telling him, "It's going to be okay." Meanwhile, my Gramps' wife is still sleeping, by the way, heavy sleeper. The being then picked up my Gramps by grabbing his leg and lifting him up in the air. My grandma was still speechless yet still somewhat calm. The being then grabbed some type of scanner, and my grandpa referred it to a Walmart scanner at the cashier. The being then began to scan his whole body. He didn't feel any type of pain, but the leg being grabbed was recently injured due to an accident at the farm. My grandmother stated mentally, "My ankle is injured, please be careful." The being then began to focus on the injured leg and scanned it for a lot longer than the rest of his body. Meanwhile, the other being in the room pulled its scanner and started to scan his wife while sleeping. This went on for about 5 to 10 minutes. The being put down by Gramps softly, and it and the other being walked through the closet and went back outside. My grandparents watched as they went back to the ship and lifted off silently and disappeared back towards the sea. Gramps got fatigued immensely and passed out back on the bed. The following morning, he woke up and tried to tell his wife what happened. She didn't believe him. He went outside to see if there were signs of it there, and you guessed it. Zip zero, not a goose eggs. No evidence whatsoever. Here's the crazier part. His leg was better. How? Who knows, but that scanner must have done something special to him. Ever since that moment, he has tried to share his story. Some were skeptical, while others believed it. I believed it, that's for sure, since he's not that type of guy, nor was it some dream. He actually went to a Spanish news channel in Puerto Rico and actually shared a part of his story. No other incident has happened to him or his wife since. Puerto Rico does have frequent encounters with UFOs and any other extraterrestrial events. My uncle was a tour guide, and PR has El Yunque, America's only national rainforest park. People used to be able to camp and hike to the peak of the mountain, but the government closed it off due to it being unsafe. It turns out multiple people have gone missing. Also at the same time, UFO sightings have also been quite frequent. It makes you wonder if the government knows anything about that area. That's his story, ladies and gentlemen. I love you, Grandpa, I miss you, and I hope you're proud of me. I'm not sure if this counts as alien or not, but I definitely saw something I can't explain at all about 5 years ago and have been dying to tell the story. About 5 years ago, me and 2 other friends were on our way back from a warped tour in Maryland being driven by one of the friends' moms because none of us had a car we could drive yet. It was almost night, the sun was still kind of out, and it wasn't that dark yet, and we were driving on a 2-lane highway that had trees on either side of the road and a median in the middle of the lanes. Basically, some creature ran out from the trees on the other side of the highway, jumped the median, and sprinted towards the trees on our side. We almost hit the thing, and our friend's mom had to slam on the brakes, and everyone in the car was screaming our heads off, not because it was a look out for that deer situation but because this was the scariest ducking looking thing I've ever seen. It was black, had long gangly limbs, and moppy black long stringy hair. This thing moved so ducking weird I can see it clearly to this day. It galloped so awkwardly, did not run at all like a deer or anything of the sort. When it jumped off of the back 2 legs and landed again on the back 2 legs before coming down and galloping across the road. Everyone in the car said the same thing. Which was what the duck was that thing. To this day, I am convinced it was a demon, an alien, or an escaped medical experiment. It was large and terrifying, and the way it moved was unlike anything I have ever seen in my life. I wish I had more details, but sadly, that's all I remember. I've asked my friends and that friend's mom about it numerous times years after the fact, and it still gives everyone shivers. I experienced something I can't explain. I'm a pretty reasonable, at times pessimistic, guy. I don't believe in ghosts and never had any unexplained event happen when I couldn't find a reasonable explanation. I've always been fascinated with space and the thought of otherworldly life, but I haven't really bought into much until the whole David Grush ball started rolling. While I try to navigate all the false information and sightings being thrown around, I do believe we are on the verge of something big happening. Anyway. Some time ago, let's say 1 to 2 months ago, during the night, my wife told me that she heard some strange horn sounds as well as some unexplainable scream-like sounds, high frequency, almost like two metals grinding. We sleep with the windows open in the bedroom, so it was very clear to her, but I slept through it. It wasn't long, and she never told me about it until a few weeks later, when she heard the scream-like sounds once again. She was really worried and freaked out in the morning, and I asked her why she didn't wake me up. Apparently she didn't want to wake me in case it was nothing. We had a son recently, so we really value our sleep. Fast forward to tonight. She poked me around 1:15 a.m. She told me she just woke up with 4 to 5 different subtle sound notes but thought it might have been her AirPods playing. It wasn't. They weren't in the room. What I heard now, however, I can't explain, and I was absolutely petrified. It sounded like it was raining outside, it wasn't, and at the same time a constant, strange breathing like gurgling sound. The gurgling was subtle and something out of an Alien/Predator movie, just much more subtle. Every 10 to 20 seconds I heard the same high-pitched scream/creature-like roar. My wife asked me if I heard it too, waiting for some reasonable explanation. I had none, and I sure as duck wasn't going to look out behind the curtains. I was really petrified. It was spine-killing screams, and with the rain/gurgling on top, it sounded like it was very close. Maybe outside our fenced property. I was more focused on trying to soak it all in so I wouldn't forget in the morning. It slowly subsided, but after 5 minutes or so, we heard a distant scream again. Maybe 2 minutes later we heard 3 horn sounds, same note, 15 or so seconds apart. Then it was quiet, and we heard nothing more. My wife told me that those horn sounds weren't like the ones she heard before. These ones were more human-like, and I guess it could have been a truck horn. It was a bit more loud than a normal car, but it was stationary, not from a highway, where the sound is moving. And we really don't have any trucks in the area that would just start going off 15 seconds apart 3 times. It makes no sense to me. Sorry for the wall of thoughts. I needed to write this down before I lose the experience, but I'm really hoping someone has a similar story. I need to know what the hell that was. I've heard nothing that comes close to this, and I have no way to explain it. I had a year-long experience of strange events that I've never been able to explain or have a full memory of. It started in winter working up north on a project. Our crew was put up in a motel 10 minutes outside of the largest town in the area. I somehow got upgraded to a king-size bed with couches, nice room. Our days were long, so I used the couches to stack my clothes in piles, jeans, hoodies, etc. I had brought my entire desktop computer with me and was in the middle of a massive argument with my ex over Facebook Messenger at 1 a.m. during the second week up there. At some point I opened my eyes, and I was sitting on top of a pile of hoodies on the couch. The time was now 4 a.m. I rushed over to the computer. At some point after 1 a.m., I had stopped typing a sentence midway through. My ex had left a ton of messages throughout the night demanding I answer her back. She also left missed calls and texts on my phone that was still sitting beside the mouse. I figured I had somehow passed out, but wasn't sure how I ended up on top of my hoodies on the couch and not just fall into bed. Went to sleep normally for the remaining couple hours before work. A couple of days later, a stranger scenario happened. My routine was we'd finish work, I'd come back to the motel around 9 p.m., shower, change, and drive into town for late night dinner at Boston Pizza, the only restaurant open late other than McDonald's. So this particular night I went through my routine, took a shower, changed, and headed for the door. I got to my car, and when I turned it on, something felt really wrong. I looked at the time, it was now 2 a.m. I had no idea how I had lost around 4 hours between showering and getting into my car. It felt weird. My whole body felt weird, but you have no idea what happened. Not a single memory or explanation. I stayed up all night scared shitless trying to figure out what happened. Why was I missing 4 hours? If I had passed out, why didn't I wake up on the floor? Why did I feel violated? The rest of the project nothing else happened, but once I got back home, things started happening that were just as weird. There's more to my experiences if people want to know. It only lasted for about a year, but those 2 events were the starting catalysts. I've never actually figured out what happened, but most people I've asked all seem to agree it had to be abduction events. Okay, I will try to keep this as brief as possible. Before I was born, my mom would dream about aliens. More specifically, she would usually dream about spaceships. After I was born, my mom started to dream that the aliens wanted to take me. She would always be upset in the dream, but apparently the people around her would tell her it's okay, she has to go. Fast forward a couple years, I'm around 12. My mom wakes up in the middle of the night, feeling like she can't go back to sleep. She goes to the window and looks out. I wasn't there, so I can't corroborate this, but she says she saw a light in the sky zip from side to side, making no noise. After that, it hovered over the house across the street for a while. Supposedly it was there long enough for her to wake up my stepdad so he could come look. He admitted to seeing it at the time but didn't want to talk about it later. He was very no-nonsense, very skeptical. Anyway, it eventually shot up and out of sight. Maybe this is nothing, who knows? So then a few years later I have the first alien-related dream that I can vividly remember. I was at my grandpa's house in this clearing staring up at the sky at night, waiting for something. Then the sky turns purple, and a massive spaceship comes over the clearing. It's all black, with light coming from windows around the sides of it. I run to my car, and the dream ends. Maybe a year after that, I woke up and there were 2 perfectly cut triangles in my sheets. These were brand new flannel sheets I had been given at Christmas. I still keep that sheet because it freaks me out. Maybe there was a flaw in the fabric from the beginning and it just ripped? It felt odd though, especially when I learned that many people report triangular body markings after an abduction. Then the strangest dream happens, about 19 or 20 years/0. I was walking downtown when all of a sudden I was lifted into the air and my body started to shake/vibrate, kind of like a cartoon character when they get electrocuted. I flew through the air like this for a while, and then I was dropped off at my back porch. I was yelling, but no sound came out, and then I looked down at my hand, and there was a piece of metal and some wires sticking out, so I ripped it out of my hand, and the dream ended. Although there was no specific alien content in the dream, I woke up thinking, aliens. It felt so real, it was as if I was conscious through the dream. The last odd occurrence was about 3 years ago. My mom started dating a guy, and they were talking one night when he said, "I think I know what one of your fears is." And my mom was like, "Okay," and he said, "You're afraid your daughter will be abducted by aliens." So my mom is shook, obviously, and he says, "Don't be afraid, they always bring her back, don't they?" My mom has still to this day not shared the whole conversation with me. So anyway, that's my story. All of this could be chalked up to an overactive imagination and or the fact that I was raised to be open to the idea of intelligent life beyond our own. It might sound like nothing but a bunch of dreams, but the feeling that went with them was more tangible, if that makes sense. Something in your mind just tells you there was more to that experience. Wondering if anyone has had a similar experience or if anyone thinks this is a load of crap. I was camping with some friends in a campground in North Georgia. It was starting to downpour, so everyone left their tents in the woods and decided to rent one of the on-site cabins for everyone to sleep in. I decided I'd just sleep in my car because they wanted to stay up late, and I was worn out from kayaking all day. I woke up to the rain stopping, and it was kind of cold in the car, and I had forgotten my sleeping bag in my tent. I checked the cabin to see if there was any room left, and the light was on and everyone was fast asleep, 3 a.m. I didn't want to squeeze in, so I decided to trek my way to my tent in the dark with a small pen light. In order to get to my tent, I had to pass by everyone's that they left. Mine was the last one, and even then it was 50 feet at least from the previous tent before it. I got in my tent, covered up with my sleeping bag, and prepared to catch the last few hours of sleep before the sun rose. No more than 10 to 15 minutes from me getting in my tent, I began to hear light whispers right outside the tent door. They weren't in English and, to my recollection, indecipherable, not any language I had heard at all. Just as the voices started, 2 orbs appeared together outside the tent. They weren't the same glare as a flashlight would make, and both were of 2 different colors that, to the best of my ability, had no real distinct color. Just colorful. The whispers outside the tent began arguing louder with each other, but still in a hushed tone. As the whispers grew louder, the lights began swirling around the tent. Behind me, to the side, to the front. Not in the movement that one could make with flashlights, and at this point I realized no footsteps could be heard. I uncovered myself and kneeled on the tent floor, preparing for the zipper to come undone like in a horror movie, and I was flipping through my mind on what option to take. I was the most terrified I had ever been. Fight or flight? The lights swirled faster, and the voices grew louder but still breathy and whispery. My mind raced, and I was sweating despite the cold. And then, just like that, the lights shut off like switches, the whispers stopped, and nothing but the silence of an empty wood. I stood there as still as I could, and I didn't dare go outside the tent until the sun came up. It was and still is the scariest moment of my life. At around 11:12, I started waking up with memories of being up in a ship, seeing aliens, the typical grays. I had been fascinated with aliens all my upbringing and thought it was awesome. I told people at school, and teasing and bullying got so bad I eventually changed schools. I told my mom, and I got a simple aha, that's nice. My parents were separated, so I only saw my dad rarely, but that year when I saw him, I started talking about it, and that's where a lot of things started falling apart. He was a huge Jesus freak and immediately started getting mad at me for talking about that stupid alien shit again. And as he berated me for past events, he brought up a bunch of times in the past that I had talked about aliens, said I had an alien friend, or times I had been with them. Up until then I had no recollection, but as soon as he started talking about the instances, I remembered them. One of the things he brought up was when we got a shirt with aliens on it a few years ago. I had talked a bunch about them. I distinctly remembered the shirt, just not talking about them. During that period, I found myself staying with my grandparents, with whom I had spent a significant amount of time as a child. I brought up that I thought I had been abducted, and she laughed, mentioning that I was talking about that again. I asked her what she meant, and she told me that when I was little, I would scream and fuss and refuse to sleep in my room, that I wanted to sleep in the living room so the aliens could take me away, so that I could go with them. They didn't see the harm, so they'd let me, and I'd fall asleep no problem. Again, once told about the events, I started to remember them. This started to really scare me. If my dad and grandma were tinfoil hat types, I would question them, but they both adamantly disbelieve in aliens, they're not in the Bible, and would never ever play along to such things. The fact that it had been a continuous thing all my life with repressed memories was terrifying. I started to go back and really think about my life and worked on remembering things. I remembered several times seeing mummies, which I now think are what very little me made the gray heads/bodies to be. I remembered being terrified to be exposed out of the blanket but would eventually leave some parts out, thinking, if they want to study my arm, they can study my arm, and I would wake up with odd thin cuts on whatever part I left out. The most damning though was remembering frequently going to the vacant lot next to my house, looking for UFO landing prints. After all this, I was obviously certain of my experiences and vocal about them. I ended up having to see a psychiatrist and a psychologist. The psychiatrist diagnosed me as schizotypical, the psychologist vetoed it, saying that anyone who believes in God could qualify, and given the amount of reported alien abductions, it wasn't his place to say it never happened. During my times of talking about things, I met someone who knew a lot about aliens and psychic phenomena and that if they were seeing me all my life, I probably had some potential. For the next couple years, I found myself down a crazy rabbit hole of conspiracy theory stuff. In addition, I had done some psychic tricks, mind reading, remote viewing, and telepathy, verified by people who did not believe me. You're probably thinking this is super ridiculous and crazy. So does everyone else. Life's really ducking weird when you know aliens and psychic stuff exist, and anyone you talk to thinks you're crazy. So I stopped talking about it. Stop telling people. Try really ducking hard to tell myself it was all just a dream, psychic shit doesn't exist, I'm crazy. The more I told myself I was crazy and that psychic stuff didn't exist, the more I lost my ability to do things with it. You tell yourself that the thing you saw was a hallucination, and that the person who witnessed it was humoring you. You drive yourself crazy by calling yourself crazy. For me to accept that aliens don't exist and I wasn't abducted is to accept that large parts of my life that have been confirmed by non-believers never happened. I haven't told anyone about it for about 5 years, I'm 31. I'm terrified of large open spaces away from people at night, and if I watch movies or things with realistic aliens, it sometimes triggers panic attacks. I thought I had a good handle on things until XCOM came out in 2012. All my friends were playing it, so I jumped on too, thinking the alien thing was behind me. Pretty much non-stop, I was having nightmares and waking up paralyzed and terrified. It happened so often, I had to tell my girlfriend the truth and stop playing. She was the last person I ever told. We broke up a few years ago, and I have no intentions of telling my current girlfriend unless it becomes absolutely necessary. As for how I got the aliens to stop taking me away, one night I built up the courage, meditated for a while, focused hard, and simply asked them to stop taking me away, saying that it was disruptive and ruining my life. I hadn't seen them since then. I think I woke up to a gray alien in my room last night. I've been up since 5 a.m., and I just can't get this off my mind. So last night I'm sleeping, and I'm having a nightmare that I'm in an apartment, looking into a kitchen area, and the drawers, cabinets, and a door, to the pantry, were all opening, closing, and moving by themselves. Almost like poltergeist activity. I was scared in the dream, so I began praying, and then my wife, who was in bed next to me, kicked my foot and woke me up because I was clearly distressed and mumbling a lot in my sleep. Here's where things get weird. I jump awake, because my wife kicked my foot, and feeling relieved to not be having a nightmare anymore, I turn my head towards my wife, who was laying behind me, and say, "Thank you, babe, I'm really sorry about that. I was having a nightmare." But I don't hear any response, so I figure that she's already fallen back to sleep, or might just be so tired that she's still kind of out of it. Then, I turn my head back to facing forwards, the direction I was facing the whole time I was sleeping, and I notice something in the corner of the room, standing in front of the bedroom door. The room was dark, but its skin still appeared to be a dark, matte gray color. It was really thin, had thin legs and long, thin arms, a small, almost childlike, torso, a narrow neck, and then a really big, bulbous head with huge black almond-shaped eyes. It looked exactly like a traditional gray alien, but it was slightly transparent. Needless to say, I was shocked. And to be honest, my very first reaction was that I was seeing things because I just woke up. So, I rubbed my eyes, and it's still right there. Trying not to panic and trying to come up with a rational explanation for it, I thought, this must just be dream chemicals still working in my brain. So, I sit up slightly and look into the other corner of our bedroom by the closet, expecting to see something there too, but there's nothing. Then I look at the ceiling, nothing. The floor is nothing. The other wall has nothing. I look back at the corner by the bedroom door, and it's still right there. Standing there, completely still, just staring at me with its huge jet black eyes, which were shaped like almonds and appeared to wrap just slightly around the side of its head, much larger than a human's eyes. And it's still slightly transparent, but I'm seeing it clearly. And only in that one spot, too. Not anywhere else in the room. Now, because the Texas power grid stinks, I always sleep with a flashlight next to the bed. And after seeing this thing for about a minute and a half, it occurs to me to grab the flashlight. I lean off the bed, reach down and grab the flashlight, and shine it in the corner of the room at this being. And because it's transparent, it became much less visible when I shined the light on it. I could still see it very slightly, but it was much less. Again, in disbelief at what I was seeing, I begin slowly scanning the whole room with the flashlight. From the bed, of course, I wasn't going to try getting out of bed, I was way too scared to be honest. And again, I see absolutely nothing strange anywhere in the room at all, except for this thing I can see in the one corner by the bedroom door. I turn the flashlight off, and instantly, I can see it super clearly again, just staring at me. I rub my eyes again and squeeze my eyes together tightly, hoping that when I open them it'd be gone. But, it wasn't. So finally I began truly freaking out internally, and I just began praying out loud. And after about 20 seconds of praying, I literally watched this thing just fade out of existence / dematerialize right in front of me. It was still standing there dead still and staring at me the whole time. It just seemed to suddenly begin becoming increasingly transparent until it was just not there anymore and it was gone. I've been awake since then. I spent the rest of the night listening random stuff here on to try and distract myself because the experience shook me up quite a bit, to be honest. I was wondering if anyone else here has ever experienced something like this. To be honest, I'm so freaked out I don't know what to think. Something I rarely speak of, but which has dramatically changed the course of my life. It's hard to put into words, and the emotions are still intense, so my writing is rather clumsy for this. I do apologize. I was 22, and I was in college. I'm 31 now. I still haven't fully recovered. November 23rd is the day it happened. I lived in the country. One side of the street had a small strip of houses with farmland behind. Houses are further apart than a typical street. Across the street was farmland, then wilderness all the way to the mountains. Pretty isolated. Unfamiliar neighbors. The backyard wasn't fully enclosed. The house had been expanded in years past, so what used to be the back patio had been turned into a greenhouse room, made entirely of windows. I lived alone. I had gotten home from a night out with friends in the nearest city, about 30 minutes away by freeway. It was sometime after 2 a.m. I hadn't had anything to drink that night because I had been going kind of hard lately, college, and wanted to take it easy. I came inside. I welcomed my cats. Nothing was out of the ordinary. I went into my bedroom and flopped down on the bed, which was nothing more than a mattress on the ground pushed up against a corner of the room. Sophisticated college living, I know. At that time, I used to keep my bedroom door open. I'm lying on my back as I drift off to sleep. I wake. I immediately notice two things. The first is an ambient light, the way dawn looks through a window, but it was still dark in the room. Second, there's something very near me. I was on my back, in bed. This thing was situated near my waist, at the side of the bed. I couldn't tell if it was standing and was only 3 feet tall or was sitting. I really only remember the face. It was gray. Large black eyes, but not as large as they make them look in movies and media. Almond-shaped. Some sort of scales or pigmentation, which looked like very aggressively furrowed eyebrows. I felt from it an intense, hateful, malevolent sensation. It wanted to hurt me. I don't know how I knew that from the feeling it emanated, but I knew. I didn't have an emotional response at first. I was too shocked. Then, I managed to utter a combination of whoa and okay, which came out as hokey as I put my hands up defensively and moved my body away from it, slamming into the wall as I did so. I didn't have time to feel any panic or terror before a hand came up and hit me in the head. My vision was awash in a world of gray milkiness, with dark gray veins interspersed. I could move, so it wasn't sleep paralysis. It felt too real to be a hypnagogic hallucination, especially since it wasn't anything near what I was dreaming about upon waking. I don't have sleep apnea, so I wasn't experiencing loss of oxygen to my brain. Though I have entertained these as possible explanations, none suffice because the experience doesn't fully meet all of the criteria of any of the phenomena. The next thing I remember is trying to wake up but being extremely disoriented. Like when you've been under anesthesia and you're trying very hard to wake up, but you can't snap out of it. I'm panicking while trying to wake. I finally snap out of it. I immediately vomit and begin sobbing uncontrollably, but I'm too scared to close my eyes. There's blood from me rubbing them to keep them open, by the time I'm able to stop crying. It takes me an hour to build up the courage to get out of bed. I grab a bat and begin clearing each room, trying to avoid panicking. There's no one there. No signs of forced entry. My cats were terrified of me, until I sat down and put on a hat. I'm bald and have dark circles under my eyes, so if they saw this thing too, the similarity might have made them scared of me. The aftermath was, and is, the hardest part. For 5 days I couldn't return home. I stayed with other people, and my ex-girlfriend would feed the cats. I finally returned home, sitting in my car in my driveway for a couple of hours, my cats peeking through the curtain to meow at me. I kept a knife taped to my back, one in my pocket, a bat by my side, and a phone with a flashlight app always nearby. I rearranged all my furniture to see all doors and windows. I noise booby-trapped rooms. I would panic if I tried to sleep at night. I developed a caffeine addiction. For the rest of my time in college, including graduate programs, I lived on a night schedule. I did not sleep until the sun came out, never left the lights off, and did not go outside of my house after dark for 5 years. No exceptions. I would stay out after dark with friends or at school but wouldn't return home until sunup. I have been unable to close my eyes voluntarily for anything longer than a blink without fear setting in. I slowly was able to push myself, out of necessity for work, back to sleeping at night and maintaining a more healthy lifestyle. But I'm frequently late to work and most often exhausted throughout the day. To this day, I still have an incredible amount of fear about falling asleep at night. I still arrange furniture tactically. I still keep a weapon near me at all times. I was never able to return to the state of physical health and confidence I had before this event. I sought help and was referred to psychologists, despite me being one. I sought out people who claimed to have had similar experiences. They were mostly mentally unsound or selling something. You don't have to believe me. This story is out there. It feels intriguing to express it in a public forum.